Start of Chapter 5. The next few months spent in the US were the most trying days of Salaar's life. Earlier too he had been to the US and Europe on holiday with his family, but the way Sikandar had packed him off now not only infuriated Salaar but also created many problems for him. His friends who had completed A-levels with him were enrolled and studying in various universities across the US. Likewise, his cousins and other relatives, and even his own siblings, were in different cities there. He wasn't all that attached to his family nor was he homesick, but the sudden forced move left him restless and miserable. His cousin, Kamran, would be away at college all day and would be busy with his assignments when he got home. Salaar, on the other hand, was cooped up in the apartment, either watching movies or flipping television channels. When he tired of this, he would simply roam around town to entertain himself. During those days in New York, Salaar had thoroughly explored the environs where Kamran lived. In the city, there was not a nightclub, discotheque, pub, bar, theater, cinema, museum or art gallery that Salaar had not been to. His academic record was such that all 3 Ivy League universities he had applied to for admission had issued acceptance letters without even waiting for his BBA results. These universities were those where none of his relatives were enrolled, nor any other friend, and Salaar had deliberately applied to them to be away from constant scrutiny. There was no one he knew there who would be sending back reports to Sikandar whose other children had not been given admission to an Ivy League institution. Sikandar should have been proud of Salaar's achievement. Instead, he and his wife were more apprehensive about being unable to tag Salaar, who had opted to join Yale. In fact, none of Sikandar's friends or relatives were in New Haven. Salaar's academic record also earned him a merit scholarship at the university. Unlike his brothers, who had taken lodging at hostels, Salaar insisted on living in an apartment. Sikandar was not in favor of this move, but the scholarship left Salaar with enough funds to rent an apartment. As for his educational expenses, Sikandar had already transferred a handsome amount to Salaar's account. Although his youngest son was also availing of a scholarship, yet Sikandar obliged Salaar's demands. It seemed that he was destined to do for Salaar all that he had not done for anyone else, and that Salaar was destined to try his father and test his patience in every way possible. If the other children went east, Salaar would go west. Whatever the others did, he would do the opposite and adamantly. And Sikandar could do nothing except work himself up into a state. Before Salaar left for New Haven, Sikandar and Taiba flew over from Pakistan especially to spend time with him. For days, they counseled him and reasoned with him. He heard them out, but did not pay any attention. He had become used to these sermons and advice, and now all counseling was like water off a duck's back, as far as he was concerned. As for Sikandar and Taiba, they were not only very worried but actually feared for Salaar as they flew for Pakistan. Salaar had selected finance as his major for MBA. Shortly after joining classes at Yale, his extraordinary abilities began to be noticed. No doubt that the institutions he had attended in Pakistan were the topmost in academic terms, but the education offered there was a piece of cake for him. At Yale, however, the competition was tough. The presence of the cream of bright students was a challenge. But there too, Salaar made his presence felt. He was exceptionally gifted intellectually, but his attitude also contributed to his profile. The typical Asian warmth and friendliness were noticeably absent, as were courtesy and affability, in his personality. He was not overawed by the environment, as Asian students tend to be by American or European universities. He had studied in the best institutions since childhood and had no complexes about his background. He had been taught mostly by foreign teachers, and he knew that their knowledge was not unlimited. If Yale had given him a scholarship, it was not doing him a special favor. The other Ivy League universities he had applied to would also have offered him a scholarship, and even if that did not happen, his parents could afford to send him to the best institution of his choice. Besides, despite his family background and social status, Salaar had a bitter side to his withdrawn nature, and he made no effort to put on an affable front to please people. The image was completed by his intimidating IQ level. He managed to draw the attention of his colleagues and professors in the first few weeks. This was nothing new, he had been doing this since his early years in school. He did not waste time indulging in pointless arguments with his teachers, but his questions were such that the teachers were often at a loss for an immediate response. If the answer was unsatisfactory, he would not argue, but accept it quietly without voicing his opinion. He debated only with those professors from whom he knew he could learn something, or else those whose knowledge was neither traditional nor academic. Salaar did not find studies difficult at Yale, nor did he spend all his time with his books. Though it was not as easy as before, but he did find time to pursue his interests. Nor was he a victim of homesickness and did not mope and yearn for Pakistan all the time. He made no special effort to search for Pakistanis in the community there, and neither did he miss the home culture and activities. But, as time passed, he got to interact with a number of Pakistanis present there. He also had membership to various societies, clubs and associations in the university. After class, he would often spend, rather squander, time aimlessly, especially on the weekends. His life was divided, it seemed, between clubs, discotheques, cinema, and theater. He missed no new film, play, concert or instrumental performance, and he had all the details about every new restaurant, big or small, pricey or cheap. And in the midst of all this activity was the adventure which had been the cause of his being in the US now. Salaar did not attempt to find out how, or when, or from whom Sikandar had learned about the secret marriage, but he made some guesses as to how it had happened. He did not suspect his friend Hassan or the maid Parveen. It must have been Imama herself who revealed all the detail, which was why she did not contact Salaar again. It must be after speaking to Imama that Salaar rummaged through Salaar's room and found the marriage papers. But when did all this happen? This question bothered Salaar as he was unable to find a logical answer to it. Thinking back on this chain of events also evoked a feeling of regret. Why did I help her? When she contacted me, I should have called up Wasim, or his parents, or my own parents and informed them about it. Or, should have told them about Jalal, or else, not listened to her at all, nor married her, nor helped her run away from home. At times, Salaar felt he had let himself be used by her, like a helpless child. Why this obsequious surrender, this obedience, he wondered, especially when there was no bond between them, nor was he obliged to help her. More than an adventure, this whole business seemed to be sheer foolhardiness. Like a psychiatrist, he tried to psychoanalyze his attitude towards Imama. With the passage of time, she'll be out of my system, completely. And even if she isn't, what difference will it make, he consoled himself. As the days passed, Salaar's circle of friends widened and among them was a boy named Saad. He was from Karachi and, like Salaar, he came from an affluent family, but unlike Salaar, Saad's family was quite religious. This was Salaar's perception. Saad had a fantastic sense of humor and was also very handsome. A friend in New Haven had introduced them and Saad was the first to extend the hand of friendship. Salaar, however, was reluctant initially, as he felt they had little in common. Saad was enrolled in the M.Phil program and was also working his way through university. His appearance, sporting a luxuriant beard, reflected his emotional attachment to his faith. He was also very knowledgeable about religion. For the first time in his life, Salaar had befriended someone who was inclined towards religion. Saad prayed regularly and would also exhort others to do likewise. He had membership in several clubs and organizations, where he was quite active. Unlike Salaar, Saad had no relatives in the US except for a distant uncle who lived in another state. Maybe, it was to dispel his solitude that he was so social. Saad was the youngest among his siblings. Perhaps it was the special affection for the youngest that persuaded his parents to send him abroad for higher education. Otherwise, he too would have joined the family business after graduation, as his brothers had done. Saad also lived in a rented apartment, but not alone, he shared it with 4 others. There were 2 Arabs, a Bangladeshi and a Pakistani, besides himself. They were all students. Saad became quite friendly with Salaar soon after their first encounter. When Salaar's friend Jeff told Saad about Salaar's academic achievements, he couldn't help but be impressed. Looking at Saad, especially at his bearded face, Salaar was always reminded of Jalal. There seemed to be striking resemblance between them. Like his other friends, Saad would also be at Salaar's over the weekend. "You're a Muslim, but you don't have clue about religion," he once told Salaar. "And you're too religious," retorted Salaar. What do you mean? The way you pray 5 times a day and keep talking about Islam, it's overdoing it, you know. Salaar was very candid. Don't you get tired of praying all the time? It's mandatory. Allah commands us to worship Him, to remember Him, Saad said emphatically. Salaar yawned lazily. You should pray too, after all, you're a Muslim. I know. Does my not praying make me a non-Muslim? Salaar's tone was sarcastic. A Muslim only in name, is that the way you want to be? Saad, please don't get into this senseless argument. I know you're into religion, but I'm not. So it is better we respect each other's views and feelings instead of forcing them down each other's throats. I'm not asking you to give up prayer, so don't insist on my praying. Salaar spoke so bluntly that he silenced Saad. A few days later Saad visited Salaar at his apartment. Salaar went to the kitchen to get something for him. Saad followed and casually opened the fridge as they were conversing. He happened to see a burger that Salaar had picked up the night before from a fast food outlet, and took it out. Put it back, you can't have that, Salaar reacted. Why not? Saad was going to put it in the microwave. Because it has pork in it, said Salaar quite casually. Saad stopped in his tracks. Don't be funny. What's so funny? Salaar said, surprised, as Saad almost flung the plate on the counter. You eat pork? I don't eat pork. I eat this burger as I like it, he replied, lighting the burner. Do you know it's forbidden, haram? Yes. And yet you eat it? Don't start off with your preaching. I eat not only pork but all kinds of meat, he replied, in a devil-may-care tone. I can't believe it. Well, what's so unbelievable about it? It's something to be eaten, said Salaar as he took the milk bottle from the fridge. Saad was incensed. Everything is not meant to be eaten. Okay, so you're not very religious, but you are a Muslim and Muslims know that pork is forbidden for Muslims. Salaar listened quietly as he went about his work. Don't make anything for me, I won't have it, Saad told him as he left the kitchen. Why? What happened? Salaar looked at Saad with some surprise, as he was washing his hands vigorously. Saad did not reply, but continued to wash his hands as he recited the kalima. Salaar, teeth clenched angrily, gave him a piercing look. I cannot eat anything kept in your fridge. In fact, I cannot eat out of your plates if you eat pork and God knows what else. Let's go out somewhere for a bite. That's very insulting. Salaar was really annoyed. No, there's nothing insulting. It's just that I do not want to eat haram stuff, and you are not used to being careful about such matters, Saad said very calmly. I didn't try to make you eat pork. I know you don't eat it, so I told you not to have that burger. But you have some sort of phobia, it seems. You're reacting as if I keep pet pigs in my apartment and live with them. Come, let's go out. Saad tried to pacify him. If we eat out, I'm not going to foot the bill, you will, said Salaar. Fine, I'll pay. No problem. Saad was somewhat relieved. And next time you visit me, bring your own food. Salaar was piqued. Will do, replied Saad. That weekend he was by the lake where many people like him were strolling around or sitting on the benches by the shore. Mindlessly, he looked around as he took a bite of ice cream. His attention was caught by a 3-year-old kicking and chasing a football. The child's mother, in hijab, stood there watching him fondly. Salaar, without realizing it, was staring at her. The boy was moving toward Salaar, following the ball which landed at Salaar's feet. Salaar stopped it with his foot, but held it there. The boy came running up and stopped short. Salaar didn't let go of the ball. He looked at the boy's mother, expecting her to come up. She did, somewhat puzzled by Salaar's reaction. Let go of the football. She spoke in a polite but firm tone. Salaar gave the ball a strong kick, sending it flying into the distance. He then looked at her very calmly. Her face had an angry blush. She said something under her breath and turned round, following her son who had run after the ball. Salaar didn't hear what she said, but it couldn't have been very complimentary. Salaar was not very proud of his behavior, but he soon realized the reason behind it. The girl looked very much like Imama. She was tall and slim, wearing a long black coat and a black hijab. Her build, her pale complexion and dark eyes were just like Imama's. Imama did not wear a hijab though, she would swathe herself in a voluminous dupatta. Looking at this girl, he was reminded of Imama, and in an involuntary way, by disregarding her he was not doing her bidding, and it made him feel good, but she wasn't Imama. What's the matter with me? To be doing this? He thought. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and putting it to his lips he fixed his gaze on that girl once again. He was oblivious to everything else but her. That night he thought about Imama for a long time, about her and Jalal. He is convinced that they were married by now because, on getting the divorce papers from Sikandar. Even though Salaar knew that despite his persuading him, Jalal was not willing to marry Imama, nevertheless, he thought that once Imama turned up at his threshold, Jalal would not be able to refuse her. She would have coaxed and cajoled him into it. Imama was really beautiful, Jalal was no match for her. Her family was among the richest and most powerful families in the country. It would have to be a fool who, despite his status, like Jalal, would reject such a profitable proposition. Or perhaps, he really was in love with her. Whatever it was, Salaar was certain that they had got married and were in hiding somewhere, away from Hashim Mubin's clutches, or perhaps, he had managed to track them down. I really should find out about her, he thought, but the very next minute, he was chiding himself. For God's sake, Salaar, what the hell? What difference does it make if her father has reached her or not? But his sense of curiosity did not abate, and he wondered why he had made no effort to find out if Imama's whereabouts had been discovered by her father. I'm Venus Edward, said the girl, extending her hand. She approached him as he was taking a book from the library shelf. Salaar Sikandar, he replied, shaking hands with her. I know, you don't need to introduce yourself, she replied warmly. Salaar didn't say that she didn't need to introduce herself, he knew all of his 50 classmates by name and by face. Moreover, he could recount a brief biodata of each one of them without making a mistake. He could have stunned Venus by telling her that she was from New Jersey, where she had worked in a beverage company for 2 years, and that she had a degree in marketing. She was at Yale for a second degree, and she was at least 5 to 6 years older than Salaar. Though he looked older because of his height and physique, but in reality he was the youngest in the class, and he was the only one who was studying for his MBA degree without having any work experience. All the others had some years of job experience, but divulging all this to Venus at this point was tantamount to raising her expectations. If I should invite you for a cup of coffee? Asked Venus. Then I would accept your invitation, he replied. She laughed. Then let's go. Salaar shrugged and, replacing the book, followed her out. They sat in the cafeteria and talked for nearly half an hour. That was the beginning of his acquaintance with Venus. Developing a relationship with any girl was no problem for Salaar, he had been doing this very smoothly, and this time it was made easier by Venus making the first move. Just after 3 or 4 meetings, he had invited Venus to spend the night at his flat, and she readily agreed. They spent much time together wandering about after class and returned to his apartment in the late hours. Salaar was in the kitchen fixing drinks for them, Venus was casually inspecting the apartment. Then she came and stood by the counter. I'd thought that since you live alone, the place would be a mess. I must say, you've kept it very well. Is this the norm, or have you tidied up the place especially for me? Salaar placed her glass before her and replied, This is how I live, in orderly style. He took a sip and, putting down his glass, moved up to her. She smiled at him as he put his hands on her shoulders and pulled her close. Then he froze as he caught sight of a pearl swinging on a gold chain round her neck. She always wore this, but he had not seen it before, as she was always clad in high-necked warm clothes because of the cold weather. That day she wore a deep-necked dress and a long coat, which she took off inside the flat. Salaar's expression changed as that pearl jolted him back to another pearl, around someone else's neck, somewhere far in the past. To hands that were performing the ablutions, and to fingers that moved from wrists to elbows, over the face, from eyes to the forehead and from the forehead to fingers sliding over the dark hair under the dupatta. The chain around Imama's neck was short so that the pearl on it rested in the hollow of her throat. Had the chain been longer, he wouldn't have been able to see the pearl. That night she was wearing a close-necked shirt and a cardigan too, but a chance look at that pearl seemed to have paralyzed him for a moment. And what a time to remember her! He tried to avoid looking at the pearl. He did not want to spoil his evening with Venus. He tried to smile back at her as she said, "I find your eyes so attractive." "Your eyes are repulsive." A voice seemed to whip him. The smile vanished from his face. Pulling away his arms from around Venus, he moved back a few steps and picked up his glass from the counter. Venus was taken aback. "What happened?" she asked, putting a hand on his shoulder in concern. Salaar did not reply. He just swallowed his drink in one gulp. Venus tried to fathom his silence as she looked on anxiously. It took just a few moments to kill his interest in Venus. He didn't know why her presence was suddenly so annoying. He had been dancing with her for the last 2 hours at a nightclub and was having a good time, and now, in a few minutes. Salaar tried to shake it off and moved towards the kitchen sink to wash his glass. Venus brought him the other glass. She stood there, arms folded across her chest, watching him as he washed the glasses. Her looking on was bothering Salaar. I'm not feeling too good," he said to her as he put the glasses on the shelf. Venus was somewhat shocked. In other words, he was asking her to leave. Her expression changed. Salaar's attitude was insulting. She stared at him coldly, then picking up her handbag and coat, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Salaar sank onto the sofa, holding his head. There was no similarity whatsoever between Venus and Imama. Even the pearls they wore around their necks were different. Yet the sight of that pearl swinging from the chain around Venus' neck revived the memory of Imama with a sharp pang. Why now, why ever? He was agitated by the thought. It had ruined an enjoyable evening. Suddenly, he picked up the crystal vase on the coffee table and, with all his might, hurled it against the wall. After the weekend, he happened to run into Venus again, but his attitude was cold and brusque. This was the only way to nip their relationship in the bud. He began to be irritated and put off by any female who reminded him of Imama in any way, and Venus had joined the list. She had been hoping he would apologize for his behavior and invite her again, but she was disappointed and badly hurt. This was her first affair at Yale. During the next few months, he was terribly busy with his studies, so busy that he had no time to remember Imama or to try and find out what had happened to her. And this situation might have continued if he had not run into Jalal by chance. Over the weekend, he had gone to Boston, where his uncle lived, to attend a cousin's wedding there. That evening, Salaar went out with his cousin to a restaurant for dinner. His cousin had stepped out after placing the order and Salaar was waiting to be served. Suddenly someone called out to him. "Hello?" Salaar turned around. "Aren't you Salaar?" the man asked. It was Jalal. For a minute, Salaar couldn't place him. He looked different. He had shaved off his beard. Salaar stood up to shake hands with him, and the adventure of a year ago repeated itself in his memory. After the perfunctory greetings, Salaar invited Jalal to join them for dinner. "No, thank you, I'm in a bit of a rush. I came over to say hello when I caught sight of you," said Jalal, glancing at his watch. "How's Imama?" Jalal asked by way of conversation. Salaar thought he had not heard him correctly. "Sorry," he asked apologetically. Jalal repeated the question. "I was asking about Imama, how is she?" Salaar looked at him, unblinking. Why was Jalal asking him about Imama? "I don't know, you ought to know about her," Salaar replied, shrugging his shoulders quizzically. "Why me?" Jalal was surprised. "Because she's your wife." "My wife?" A jolt went through Jalal. "What are you saying? How can she be my wife when I had refused to marry her?" "You know that very well because you were the one who came to talk to me about this a year ago," he reminded Salaar. "In fact, I had asked you to marry her yourself." Salaar looked at him uncertainly. "I approached you thinking that you may have married her," Jalal explained. So you didn't marry her? Salaar queried. No, I had already spoken to you. How was that possible when I had clearly refused? I came to know that she had left home and gone away, and I supposed she was with you. That's why I came up when I saw you. I have no idea where she is. I've been here for the last 7 or 8 months, Salaar replied. And I've been here last month, Jalal told him. After meeting me, did she meet you or try to contact you? Salaar was perturbed now. No. How can that be, that she should go to Lahore and not try to reach you? Salaar found it unbelievable. What would she have achieved by contacting me? She left home for your sake. You should have gone to her. No, she didn't run away from home for me. You know that very well. I had told her very clearly that I could not marry her, so please don't say that she did it for me. Jalal's tone had changed. The whole affair was discussed with you. You mean to say that she really did not approach you again? Why would I lie to you? And if she was with me, then why would I ask you about her? Anyway, I'm getting late, Jalal said abruptly. Can I have your contact number? Asked Salaar. No. I don't think that you and I have any need to keep in touch. Jalal's response was blunt and candid. He turned around and left. Confused, Salaar kept staring at Jalal as he walked away. It was unbelievable that she did not meet Jalal again. Why? Did she really believe me that Jalal had married someone else? Salaar remembered lying to her, but how could she have trusted Salaar's word when she herself had said that she did not believe him? His mind was in turmoil. He pulled up a chair and sat down again. If she did not go to Jalal, then where did she go? Was there some other man in her life about whom she had kept it secret from me? But, no, she would have told me to contact the other guy. Even if she had not met Jalal immediately, she should have gone to him after she got the marriage papers from Sikandar and got to know about her divorce rights. Salaar wasn't sure why he had spoken to her about Jalal's make-believe wedding. Perhaps he wanted to make her anxious or to see what she'd do next, or maybe it was because he was fed up with her constant requests to go talk to Jalal. Whatever it was, Salaar was sure that Imama would go to Jalal for help. But now he discovered that, contrary to his expectations, that was not what she did. The waiter served their order. Salaar's cousin had also returned and they ate while they made small talk. But even as he was eating and speaking, Salaar's mind was lost in thought about Imama and Jalal. Her memory had come alive after many months. Could she have gone back home? The thought struck Salaar. His mind seemed to be stuck in this groove. I'm sure she has. I talked to Papa and asked him, he would certainly know. Sikandar was also in town for the family wedding. Late at night, when Salaar found his father alone, he approached him. Dad, has Imama returned home? He asked straight away. The unexpected question left Sikandar speechless for a while. Why do you want to know? He asked sharply. Just like that. There's no need to think about her or wonder about her fate. It's better that you should concentrate on your studies. Please answer my question. Why? What have you got to do with her? Sikandar's temper flared. I met her boyfriend today, the one she wanted to marry. So? So why didn't they get married? He said that Imama never came to see him. I had expected that's where she'd go when she went to Lahore. Sikandar interrupted him. Whether she went to meet him or not, whether they got married or not, it's none of your business. You do not need to get involved in this affair. Yes, I agree it's none of my business, but I want to know if she came to you. How did you get the divorce documents to her? I mean, through whom were they sent to her? Who told you that she'd contacted me? Salaar was surprised by his father's question. I estimated that. She did not contact me at all, and if she had, would have informed Hashim Mubin about it. Salaar kept looking at his father. I searched through your room and that's where I found the marriage papers, Sikandar disclosed. When you made me come here, you said you'd send the divorce papers to Imama. Yes, but that was in the situation of her getting in touch with me, and she didn't. Why are you so sure that she contacted me? It was Sikandar's turn to query. Salaar was quiet for a few moments. Then he asked, didn't the police find out anything about her? No, if the police had discovered anything, she would have been home by now. They are still searching for her, Sikandar answered him. This is certainly decided, Salaar, that you will not get into another drama about Imama. You should not rack your brain about where she is or how she is, because you have nothing to do with her. As soon as the police trace her, I'll hand over those papers to Hashim Mubin so that you're free of this hassle. Dad, did she really never call for me? Salaar asked, not really paying attention to Sikandar's earlier remarks. Did she ever call you? She called just once, and then I came away here. Maybe, she called again and you're not telling me about it. She did not. If she'd called, I would have sorted out many issues regarding your marriage. I would have completed the divorce proceedings on your behalf. By the way, how would you do that? Salaar appeared very calm. I had taken your signature on a blank paper when you were leaving. I have had the divorce papers prepared, Sikandar declared smugly. Fake document. I didn't know you were getting my signature to file for divorce. Do you want to start this mess all over again? Sikandar flared up. I'm not saying that I want to have a relationship with her. What I'm telling you is that you cannot sever this relationship on my behalf. This concerns me and I alone will deal with it. You should be grateful that you're living here safe and secure. The family that you've taken on is so powerful that they would pursue you to the grave. It's entirely possible that they're keeping a watch on you here as well, waiting for you to feel confident enough to contact Imama so that they can bury you both alive. You're making a futile attempt to frighten me. First, I'm not ready to accept that they have me under observation out here, and that too after such a long time. The other thing is that I am not in touch with Imama, as I really have no clue of her whereabouts, so there's no question of any contact. Then why are you so conscious of her welfare? Let her be wherever and however she may be. Sikandar was somewhat relieved. Please check my cell phone bills. She has my cell phone, she may be using it to make calls. She's not using your cell phone. It's permanently switched off. The few calls she did make were to her college friends, and the police has already questioned them. In Lahore, Imama went to a friend's place, but that girl was away in Peshawar and Imama left her friend's house before her return. The police were unable to trace where she went. Salaar watched his father with a piercing gaze, then said, Hassan told you all about me and her? Sikandar had no answer to this. Only Hassan knew about Imama as having Salaar's cell phone. Sikandar could not claim this discovery as a result of searching Salaar's room. Talking to his father, Salaar suspected Hassan of having spilled the beans because Sikandar knew minute details of this entire affair that were only in Salaar's or Hassan's knowledge. There was no third person involved. Since Salaar had not divulged anything to his father, undoubtedly it was Hassan who had apprised him of all that had taken place. What difference does it make, whether it was Hassan or whoever? It was not like I wouldn't have come to know. It was foolish on my part to have shrugged off Hashim Mubin's accusations and to have believed you instead. Salaar sat quietly, without a word, as Sikandar spoke, but his expression mirrored his displeasure and anger. Now that I have pulled you out of this unpleasant situation, you should not do anything that will. Sikandar's tone was gentler, but before he could even complete a sentence, Salaar suddenly got up and left the room. The conversation with his father swirled round Salaar's mind all night. For the first time, he felt a sense of remorse, unhappiness. He should have complied with Imama's request and divorced her at the outset. She would have gone to Jalal, married him and settled down. Despite the aversion he felt towards Imama, he had to admit he was at fault. She didn't contact me again. She didn't go to court to file for divorce. Her family hasn't yet been able to locate her. She didn't go to Jalal either, so wherever did she disappear? Could it be that she'd met with a mishap? He pondered, deeply and seriously, about her. For the first time he thought about Imama without a hint of irritation or annoyance. It can't be that she's living quietly somewhere as my wife, although she loathes me. Why has she made no effort to get in touch with anyone? Worrying thoughts kept surfacing. It had been more than a year since the marriage. Had she really met with an accident? He kept mulling over what could possibly have happened to her, but after some time, his thoughts were back on their usual track. Well, what can I do if something untoward has happened? She left home at her own risk, and anyone can be involved in such a situation. So why am I flogging myself when I have no further connection with her? Dad was right that I need not be concerned, especially about a girl who's ungrateful to the point of arrogance. She looks down on others and probably deserved what she got. Salaar tried to shake her out of his mind. The repentant sobriety he had briefly experienced vanished. He wasn't particularly sorry now about such a trivial matter. He relaxed and closed his eyes. Imama was nowhere in his thoughts. Have you ever been to Van Dame? Asked Mike as he left the university with Salaar. Once. How's it? Not bad. We should go there on a weekend, suggested Mike. Why? My girlfriend's very interested in that place, she goes there often. Then you should go with her, remarked Salaar. It'll be more fun if we all go, replied Mike. Who's all? Asked Danish, joining in the conversation. All of our friends, you, me, Salaar, Sethi and Saad, Mike explained. Drop Saad, he'll freak out at the mention of nightclubs or deliver a long sermon, Salaar interrupted. Fine, then it's just us, confirmed Danish. Let's invite Sandra too. Salaar suggested his girlfriend's name. So they went to Van Dame on a Saturday night and enjoyed themselves thoroughly. The next morning Salaar slept late. He was fixing his lunch when Saad called. Have you just woken up? He asked, hearing Salaar's groggy voice. Must have stayed up till all hours, I suppose. Yes, we'd gone out. Salaar deliberately avoided the word nightclub. We meaning you and Sandra? No, the whole group, Salaar said. The whole group? And you ditched me? Saad was hurt and annoyed. We never thought of you. Salaar's plain talk really hit Saad. You're a creep, Salaar, a very cheap guy. Was Danish there too? All of us, my dear, all. Salaar's tone was complacent, mocking. Why was I left behind? Saad's annoyance increased. Because children aren't taken to such places, you're not mature enough, teased Salaar. I'll break your bones, you. Then you'll know. I'm not joking, Yar, we didn't ask you because you wouldn't have gone there anyway, Salaar clarified. Why? Were you going to hell that I'd refuse? Well, you would have called it hell. We went to a nightclub, would you have come along? Why not? Salaar was taken aback by this response. You'd have come? Of course. Saad affirmed. And what would you do there? You don't drink, you don't dance, so what would you do? Lecture us on our folly? Not quite. So, I don't drink or dance, but it would have been a nice outing. I'd have enjoyed it. Doesn't Islam forbid such activities, going to such places? Salaar's tone was acerbic. After a brief moment of silence, Saad replied, I wouldn't be doing anything wrong, just enjoying the change of scene. Okay, we'll include you the next time we plan something. Had I known last night I'd have called you. We really had a good time. Anyway, what's your program today? Saad was somewhat pacified. They chatted a while, then rang off. What are your plans this weekend? Saad asked Salaar. They were in the campus cafeteria. I'm going to New York with Sandra. Why? Her brother's getting married, she's invited me. When do you return? Saad asked. Sunday night. Then let me have the keys to your apartment, I'll spend the weekend there. I have to work on some assignments, and all 4 of my flatmates will be home this weekend. I can't get any work done, Saad elaborated. Fine, you can stay there, shrugged Salaar. Salaar planned to leave with Sandra on Friday night. It was by chance that some work held her back and they had to postpone their departure till the next morning. Sandra was living as a paying guest, so Salaar had no choice but to go home for the night. He had given one of his keys to Saad and carried the other with him. He got home after 11 p.m. and let himself in using his own key as he didn't want to disturb Saad's studies. The lounge was empty but the lights were on. Salaar felt uneasy. he wanted to get to his bedroom, but stopped at the door. Sounds of conversation and laughter came from the other side. Saad had female company. Salaar froze in his tracks. Saad was the only one in their group who, they believed, had no relationship with the opposite sex. This was not expected of someone as religious as he was. Salaar turned back, uncertainly. He caught sight of a bottle and glasses on the living room table. Used plates and cutlery lay on the kitchen counter. Salaar left the apartment without a minute's pause, as quietly as he had entered. He could not believe what he had heard and seen. Saad with a woman. It was incredible. A man who did not touch forbidden meat or alcohol, who prayed 5 times a day, and who preached Islam all the time, that he should do such a thing. The bottle and glasses indicated they'd been drinking, eating and drinking in the very home that Saad considered unclean. Salaar smiled wryly at the thought that someone out to prove himself a pious, practicing Muslim should turn out to be such a fraud. Here was Saad laying claim to being the only true Muslim in all of the USA, and the other real Muslim was that girl Imama who went around wearing a tent-like dupatta, but had no qualms about running away from home for love. Salaar was disgusted with these so-called true believers and the extent of their lies and hypocrisy. Salaar grumbled to himself as he drove the car out of the parking lot. It was too late to go to Sandra's, so he decided to go to Danish's. Danish was surprised to see him. Salaar pretended he was bored on his own, and so he had come to spend the night at Danish's place. Danish was satisfied with the explanation. Saad had left when Salaar got back on Sunday night, as planned. There was no evidence or indication of a woman's presence. The wine bottle had disappeared. Salaar surveyed his apartment with a sardonic smile. Everything was in place as he had left it. He then called up Saad. After a casual exchange of pleasantries, he said, "So did your studies go well? All assignments completed?" "Thanks, friend, I got to focus on my studies the last 2 days. The assignments are almost done too." "How was your trip?" Saad asked. "Very good. How long did it take you?" "No problem with driving at night, I hope?" Saad said perfunctorily. "No, we didn't travel at night." "Meaning?" "Meaning that we didn't leave on Friday night but on Saturday morning instead," Salaar explained. "Did you stay the night at Sandra's?" "No, at Danish's." "You may as well have come home." "I did," Salaar remarked as a matter of fact. There was complete silence at the other end. Salaar laughed to himself. Saad must be shaken to hear this. "You came, warehouse." "When?" he stammered. "Around 11 p.m. You were busy with some girl and I didn't think it proper to disturb you. So I left." Salaar could not have guessed Saad's state of shock. He was speechless. He never expected Salaar to discover his activities and expose him this way. "Incidentally, you've never introduced me to your girlfriend," Salaar added. He imagined Saad struggling to breathe. "Just one of those things," Saad murmured. "I'll introduce you. But don't mention this to anyone," he added quickly. "Why would I?" "You needn't worry." Salaar could understand Saad's mental and emotional state. He felt a little sorry for him too. Saad cut short their conversation. Salaar had a fairly good idea of his embarrassment. After this incident, Salaar thought that Saad would not flaunt his faith, his religiosity and preaching, at least, not before him, but he was surprised to note that Saad hadn't changed a whit. He continued to talk about religion with a passion, vigorously exhort people to follow Islamic precepts and to pray, and to check them on un-Islamic practices. For hours on end Saad would talk about his love for Allah and Islam, and would support his views with quotes from the Quran or Hadiths and even become misty-eyed when doing so. Apart from his own group, there were others too who were much impressed by Saad and his personality. They envied him for his love of God, an exemplary Muslim despite the passion of youth and the rush of life. Without a doubt, Saad knew how to speak and influence people, except Salaar, on whom Saad's preaching had no effect whatsoever. Salaar was not convinced that Saad's bearded Islamic appearance was a mark of his faith, nor by his soft-spoken style or his respect and courtesy for others. Salaar's repulsion for religious people began with Imama. Jalal took this negative feeling further and Saad stretched it to the limit. Salaar believed that all such apparently religious persons took hypocrisy to its height. In the garb of an outwardly religious appearance, they were given more to immorality than those who did not profess piety. Coincidentally, these three people that he had come across confirmed his belief. Imama Hashim, a hijab-observing girl, had ditched her fiancé for another man and under cover of night, ran away from home. Jalal, who sported a pious mien, professed his love of Prophet, peace be upon him, in his melodious knots, had an affair with a girl and rejected her, who cleverly compartmentalized the worldly and the spiritual for his own convenience. And Saad, Salaar's opinion of him was further lowered by another incident. Saad came over to Salaar's one day when the latter was busy at his computer, working on an assignment. They got talking and then Salaar had to step out for some groceries from a neighborhood store. Saad stayed back. It took Salaar about half an hour to get home. When he returned, he found Saad busy chatting online. They talked for a while before Saad went away. Salaar had lunch and then went online. As he was doing so, he checked the history that Saad had been accessing. There he found those websites and pages that Saad had opened up. They were all pornographic. Salaar would not have been surprised nor objected if he himself or any of his other friends indulged in such viewing, but to find Saad visiting such sites was a shock. Saad fell in Salaar's opinion. Then what are your plans? Are you coming back to Pakistan? Sikandar was speaking to Salaar. He informed his son that he was going to Australia for a few weeks with Taiba to attend a family wedding there. What would I do in Pakistan if you both are not going to be there? Salaar said forlornly. That's not on, meet your brother and sister. Anita misses you a lot, replied Sikandar. Dad, I'm okay here, I'll spend my holidays here. There's no point in returning to Pakistan. Then come along with us to Australia. Moise is coming too. I'm not crazy enough to just tag along with you to Australia, Salaar said wearily. Besides, there's hardly any understanding between Moise and myself that you should tell me about his company. Well, I won't compel you, you can stay there if you want to, but look after yourself. And Salaar, you should not do anything that's wrong. Sikandar warned him. Salaar knew very well what his father meant by this allusion to anything wrong, but he was so used to it because Sikandar always said this at the end of every conversation. Salaar would have been surprised if he didn't say so. Salaar cancelled his booking after speaking to Sikandar. Then he lay on his bed and staring at the ceiling, began to think about what to do when the university closed down for the vacations. I should go skiing somewhere or go to another state, he thought. Fine, I'll go to a travel agent tomorrow, after class, and we'll work it out from there, he decided. The next day he finalized a skiing program with a friend. He then informed Sikandar of his plan. A day before the holidays began, Salaar went to an Indian restaurant for dinner, and then after spending some time there, he went to a pub nearby where he had a few pegs of whiskey. Around 10, he headed home. A sudden wave of nausea overcame him. He pulled the car to the side and stepped out. For a while he paced up and down on the patch of grass alongside the road. The cool breeze and the nip in the air seemed to help him feel better, but once again he had another bout of nausea, accompanied by pain in his chest and stomach. He didn't know whether it was the food or the whiskey that was responsible for this misery. His head was spinning and as he bent over, he suddenly threw up. He was still doubled over, even though his stomach had emptied out, he felt no better. When he tried to straighten up, his legs were weak and wobbly. He tried to turn back towards his car, but his head was in a daze and his sight was blurred as he tried to focus on his car. He made a futile attempt to move a few steps, but he was too weak and fell to the ground. He tried to get up but he was sinking into the dark. Before he lost consciousness, he could hear someone shake him. Someone was talking to him a loud voice. It seemed there was more than one person. Salaar tried to shake his head but he couldn't even move it. He tried to open his eyes, but they would not respond. He slipped away into complete darkness. He had spent 2 days in the hospital. A couple, passing by the road where he had collapsed, saw him fall and brought him to the hospital. According to the doctors, Salaar was the victim of food poisoning. He regained consciousness a few hours after being admitted, but despite wanting to return home, Salaar was too weak to move. The next evening he felt better, but the doctor advised him to spend another night at the hospital. Salaar got home on Sunday afternoon and the first thing he did was to call up the tour operator and cancel the skiing trip. He had planned to leave on Monday morning and to try once more to get Sandra to go with him. When he cancelled his plans, he didn't call up Sandra or any other of his friends. Salaar had a light sandwich and a cup of coffee for lunch, then he took a tranquilizer and went to sleep. The next day he woke up at 11, he had a severe headache. He felt his forehead and his body burning with fever. Oh, come on, he was quite exasperated. After spending 2 days being ill, he wasn't planning to spend the next 2 days likewise, but that's how it was going to be, he estimated. He dragged himself out of bed, and without even washing up, headed for the kitchen to get a cup of coffee. Then he began to check the answer service on his phone for missed and recorded calls. There were a few from S.A.W who had been trying to speak to Salaar before leaving for Pakistan, and was quite annoyed at Salaar's disappearing without a word. There were calls from Sandra who believed that Salaar had gone off skiing without meeting her. Sikandar and Kamran also called, thinking that Salaar had gone off without a word. There were some calls from other friends and classmates who were leaving for home. They all asked Salaar to call back, and he would have done so had he not been laid low. He could have called S.A.W, Sikandar and Kamran in Pakistan, but was in no mood to do so. Salaar finished his coffee with a couple of slices of bread, then he took his medicines and went and lay down again. He thought he'd be rested enough by the evening to bring down the fever. His estimate proved to be totally wrong. When he awoke from the drug-induced sleep that evening, his body was burning with fever. His mouth and tongue were parched and his throat was dry and sore. His head and his entire body were racked with pain. Perhaps it was the pain that broke his sleep. He lay prone, his hands gripping his forehead. He tried to ease the pain by massaging his temples with his thumbs, but to no avail. He gave up and just lay still, his face buried in his pillow. Salaar was not aware of when he fell asleep again, trying to endure the pain that gripped his being. When he awoke again, the room was in complete darkness. It was night and not just his room, but the entire apartment was in the dark. He was in greater distress than before. He made a futile attempt to get up from his bed, but his body seemed to have no energy and he lay down. Once again, he felt himself slipping into a state between slumber and unconsciousness. He could hear himself groaning but he could not stop himself from the act. Despite the central heating, he was shivering uncontrollably. The blanket couldn't warm him nor was he able to get into warmer clothes. Once more, he felt the pain cut through his chest and stomach. Salaar's tortured cries intensified as waves of nausea washed over him. He tried to get up and go to the bathroom, but was too weak to move. He struggled and sat up, but before he could get off the bed, he retched violently and threw up whatever he had had in the past few hours. Even in this semi-conscious condition he was aware of the filth on his clothes and blanket, but he found himself almost paralyzed, groaning and mumbling in a daze, senseless. How long this state lasted he did not know, but he did recall that at one point he felt he was dying, and for the first time the thought of death terrified him. He wanted to somehow reach the phone, to call someone, but he was unable to move. The soaring fever had pinned him down. Eventually his fever subsided and, far into the night, he emerged from his near-comatose condition. He opened his eyes to the dark in the room. His body wasn't burning and the chill had left him, but the pain in his head and body lingered, albeit to a lesser degree. For a while he lay staring at the ceiling, then he searched for the switch and turned on the bedside lamp. The light, after the long spell of dark, blinded him, forcing his eyes shut. He felt his eyelids with his fingers. His eyes were swollen and they hurt. With an effort, he kept his eyes open and looked around the room, trying to remember what had befallen him. Short bursts of memory revived the events. Salaar was sickened at his state. Still sitting on his bed, he unbuttoned his shirt and flung it off. With feeble tottering steps, he got off the bed and pulling away the sheet and blanket, threw them on the floor. Still staggering, he went into the bathroom. He was shocked when he caught sight of himself in the mirror. His eyes were sunken in, dark shadows encircling them, his face was pale and his lips were dry and peeling. Anyone looking at him would believe he had been suffering from a long illness. Have I grown such stubble in just 24 hours, he thought, as he ran his fingers over his face. I didn't look half as bad in the hospital after that food poisoning episode as in this one day's fever, he mumbled incredulously as he scrutinized his appearance in the mirror. Filling the tub with warm water, he stepped in. He was surprised why, in spite of the fever, he had not immediately changed out of those filthy clothes, instead of just lying there. Having bathed, he went into the kitchen. He was ravenously hungry. He made some noodles for himself. I must go to the doctor tomorrow for a complete checkup, he decided as he ate. He felt light and better after the shower, but his whole being felt drained and weak. He had switched on the TV while eating and flicked channels to find something suitable. There was a talk show going on. Salaar stopped eating, spoon poised in mid-air. He stared at the TV in distraction and picked up the remote to change channels. Now he was looking carefully at the programs on each channel and the confusion on his face was growing. What's this? He remembered that it was Friday night when he had been taken ill and had collapsed on the road, and had been taken to the hospital. Saturday was spent there, and he had returned to his apartment on Sunday. After going to sleep on Sunday afternoon, he had awakened the next morning at 11. That night he had fever which must have lasted till Tuesday, and it must be Tuesday night now. But the television channels told a different story. It was Saturday night and the next day would be Sunday. Salaar glanced at his watch, lying on the living room table, and his mouth fell open in amazement. He put down the bowl of noodles. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the date on his watch. Does this mean that I've been ill for 5 days? Out of my senses for 5 whole days? How can that be? How is it possible? He muttered. 5 days is a long time. How come I did not even notice the passage of time? How could I just lie there, senseless, for 5 days? He stumbled towards his telephone to check the answering service. There were no calls. Dad didn't even call me, and neither did S.A.W. What's the matter with them? Didn't they miss me? Salaar was shocked to find there were no messages for him. He sat silently by the phone for a long time. How can it be that Dad did not even think of me? None of my friends thought of me. How could they just abandon me? He realized for the first time that the thought made his hands tremble. It wasn't weakness or debility, but then what was it that had shaken him so? He sat down on the sofa and tried to finish the noodles, but they were no longer appetizing. He felt as if he was chewing in pieces of soft rubber. He couldn't eat any more. He was in a strange state of uncertainty. Had he really spent 5 days alone and that neither he nor anyone else had known what had befallen him? He went into the bathroom again. His face was not as haggard after taking a shower, but the dark circles around his eyes and his overgrown stubble were still there. He stood there, staring at his reflection and touching the shadows under his eyes as though he didn't really believe what he saw. Suddenly, his hirsute face was bothering him. He took out the shaving kit and prepared to shave. He realized then that his hands were still trembling and, in close sequence, he managed to nick his face in 3 places. He washed his face and patted it dry, trying to stanch the thin trickle of blood that had appeared. Vacantly, he kept staring at his image. The cut bled again, dark blood oozing out, and unblinking, he watched the tiny drops roll down his face. What's next to ecstasy? Pain. A cold, low voice spoke. He stood rooted to the ground. What's next to pain? Nothingness. He remembered each word. Nothingness, he mumbled, looking at himself in the mirror. The movement made the drops of blood roll down his face. And what comes after nothingness? Hell. Salaar retched again, all of a sudden, and doubled over the wash basin. The food he had finished eating a few minutes ago was ejected once again. He turned on the tap to clear away the mess. He remembered what he had asked her next and what her reply had been. You're unable to make any sense of anything right now, and you won't be able to either. There'll come a time when everything will be clear to you and you'll understand it all. In every life, there's a time when everything becomes clear, when there's no more mystery. I am passing through that stage, she had said, but that stage will come upon you at some future point. Then remember to check if it doesn't amuse you. Salaar retched again. He felt his eyes streaming. In life, at some time or another we come to a point where all relationships cease, where there is only us and Allah. There are no parents, brother or sister, or any friend. Then we realize that there is no earth under us nor is there sky above, but only Allah who is supporting us in this emptiness. Then we realize our worth, it is not more than a grain of sand or the leaf of a plant. Then we realize our existence is only confined to our being. Our demise makes not a whit of difference to the world around us, nor to the scheme of things. Salaar was feeling an unusual pain in his chest. He licked the water flowing down his face and he retched again. His thoughts continued. We come to our senses, we understand our utter insignificance. He was trying to rid the voice from his mind. He wondered why he remembered her now. He splashed water on his face, wiped it, opened the bottle of aftershave and applied it to the wounds on his cheek. For the first time, he felt the pain. Coming out of the bathroom, he realized that his hands were trembling even now. I must go to the doctor. He clenched his fists. I need help. I must get myself checked up. He did not know this feeling of wild fear. He was suffocating. He felt as though someone was slowly squeezing the life out of him. Is it possible that my people would forget me this way? He took out clean clothes from his wardrobe and started to put them on. He wanted to get to the doctor fast. Suddenly, the apartment became a frightening place. That night, on returning home, he had been awake almost the whole night. He was in a strange state, he could not accept that he had been forgotten. He had always been well looked after by his parents. Considering the way he was, Sikandar and Taiba had handled him cautiously. They always worried for him, but now he felt that for the last few days he was completely out of everyone's lives, his parents, brothers and sister, friends. If, as a result of his illness, he had died in his apartment, probably no one would have known. Maybe till his corpse had begun to rot, and in this weather how much time would that take? That night, he checked the phone's answering service every hour. In a state of disbelief, he spent all of the next week waiting for someone to call, but no one called. Have they all forgotten me? He panicked. After waiting a whole week, like a fool, for someone to call, he himself tried contacting his folks. He wanted to tell them what had happened to him and what he had been through. He wanted to share his woes with them. But, for the first time, he felt as though nobody was really interested in him. Everybody had details of their own activities. Sikandar and Taiba kept telling him of their holiday in Australia and how much they were enjoying it. He heard them absent-mindedly. Are you enjoying your holidays? After a long conversation, Taiba inquired about him. Me? Yes, very. He could utter only just these 3 words. He did not really know what to tell Taiba, what to disclose to her. Speaking to everyone that he called, he faced this situation for the first time. He realized that they were primarily interested in their own lives. Maybe, if he had told them what he had been through, they would have expressed shock, and maybe they would have got worried. But this would happen after he had told them. What place did he have in their lives? Was anyone interested to know what had occurred? Perhaps then he pondered for the first time that if his life were to end, why would it affect anyone else? What change would it bring to the world? What would his family feel? Nothing, except grief for a few days. As for the rest of the world, it would not be affected even momentarily. If Salaar Sikandar were to vanish, would it make any difference to anybody? He tried to banish such dark thoughts, but the despair in his state of mind overcame him. What's come over me? Of what consequence is it if people were to forget me temporarily? Several times I have myself lost contact with a lot of people. Then, why bother if this has happened with me? But why did this happen to me? And if I had really not regained consciousness? If my fever had not subsided, if the pain in my chest and stomach not abated? He tried to rid his mind of these troubling thoughts, but could not. He was more in fear than in pain. Maybe, I'm becoming too sensitive, otherwise why should I let mere temporary unconsciousness get to me so? He fretted. At least now I've recovered, but why am I thinking of death? After all, I've fallen ill before also. Tried to commit suicide without cause, but now, why am I being assailed by these fears? His agony increased. Nor do I remember the misery of the fever. It was, perhaps, only a dream or somewhat like a coma. I can't recall more. He tried to smile. What is bothering me? What disease? Or is it the realization that nobody needed me, nobody thought of me, not even my loved ones, my own family, my friends? Oh, my God, what's happened to you, Salaar? Sandra exclaimed, seeing him on the first day of the new semester. Nothing really. Salaar tried to smile. Have you been ill? She asked concernedly. Yes, a little. But it appears to me that you have been quite ill. You've lost weight and have got dark rings around your eyes. What were you ill with? Nothing much. Just a little fever and food poisoning, I suppose. He smiled. Were you away in Pakistan? No, I was here. I phoned you several times before leaving for New York. Each time the answering service responded. You should have recorded that you'd left for Pakistan. Just stop it, he exploded. You're bombarding me with questions. Sandra looked at him in amazement. You're interrogating me as if you were my wife. Salaar, what happened? Nothing happened. Now, you stop all this talk of what, where, how, why rubbish. Sandra could not speak for a few moments. She had no inkling that he would react so. Sandra was not the only one to have expressed such concern to Salaar. All his other friends and acquaintances had reacted similarly on seeing Salaar. By the end of the day Salaar was thoroughly rattled and had become somewhat aggressive. He had not gone to the university to be interrogated. The concern of his friends repeatedly reminded him that something really awful had happened to him, and he wanted release from this realization. Would you like to go to the movies this weekend? Danish, who was visiting Salaar, asked. Yes, would, Salaar agreed. Then be ready. I'll pick you up. Danish confirmed the arrangement. Danish picked up Salaar as arranged. Salaar had gone to the movies after several weeks and he was looking forward to an enjoyable evening, but 10 minutes after the movie began he suddenly felt an acute and inexplicable fear. The characters on the screen ahead appeared to him like puppets that he could not understand. He quietly got up and left. He sat on the bonnet of Danish's car in the parking lot for a long time, then hailed a taxi and returned to his apartment. Professor Robinson had started his lecture. Salaar noted on the paper in front of him the date and the topic. He was speaking on the economic recession. As always, his eyes were fixed on the professor but his mind was elsewhere. This had happened the first time in his life that he did not know where he was mentally. His mind flitted from one image to another, and then onto another. From one scene to another, and then onto another. He heard one voice, then another and yet another. He had no idea where his journey started or where he was. Salaar, shall we not leave? Sandra asked, shaking his shoulder. He was startled. The classroom was empty and only Sandra was besides him. He looked in bewilderment at the empty classroom, the wall clock and then at his wristwatch. Where's Professor Robinson? He blurted out. The class is over and he has left. Sandra replied, looking at him somewhat amazed. The class is over? He doubtingly asked. Yes. Salaar rubbed his eyes vigorously and leaned back. The only thing he remembered of Professor Robinson's lecture was the topic and nothing else. He did not know what the professor had said. You're looking a bit upset? Sandra inquired. Nothing, really nothing. I want to sit here alone for some time. Okay, Sandra said looking at him, and picked up her things and left. He crossed his arms across his chest and started staring at the blackboard ahead. This was the third such occurrence of the day. He had thought that on rejoining the university everything would fall back to normal and that he would come out of his depression. But that did not happen. At the university too he continued to be a complete victim of his mental turmoil. Also, for the first time, he was losing interest in his studies, everything appeared artificial to him. For the first time in his life, he had gone into deep depression. Studies, university, friends, club, parties, restaurants, outings, and the like had become meaningless for him. He had stopped meeting friends. His phone often had a recorded message that he was not home. On the insistence of his friends, he would relent to go out with them, but at the last moment drop out. Even if he did go, he would suddenly leave without saying a word. He was doing the same thing at the university. He would attend one day and absent himself the next two. One class he would attend and forgo the next two. Sometimes, he would spend the whole day in bed in his apartment. He would start watching a film, but after a couple of minutes, he'd have no clue as to what he was watching. It was the same when he'd be flicking through the TV channels. His appetite had disappeared, he'd begin to eat but halfway, he'd leave the food and some days, he'd go without it. All he did was to down endless cups of coffee. He wasn't a chain smoker, but he had become one now. He was an organized and tidy person by nature, but now his apartment was the picture of chaos and dirt. He wasn't bothered by the sight of stuff strewn around the place. His contact with his parents and siblings had decreased and his conversation with them reduced to a minimum. They would keep talking and he would listen, hardly responding. He had nothing more to tell them or share with them, it had all come to an end, and he had no idea why this had happened. But he knew that all these events, these thoughts were related to Imama Hashim. Had she not come into his life, all this would not have happened. First he disliked her, now he hated her. The slight sense of regret he had earlier disappeared altogether. Whatever happened to her was justified. Whatever I did to her was right. That is what she deserved, he kept telling himself. He loathed every word, every line that she had uttered. The memory of Imama's conversations would drive away his sleep and peace of mind, he'd be engulfed by strange desperation. All that he had scoffed at now haunted him. Am I going mad? Slowly losing my mind? Am I becoming schizophrenic? Strange fears would grip him unexpectedly. The lack of meaning and purpose in everything was becoming increasingly apparent. Who was he? What was he and why? Where was he and why was he there? Such questions had begun to bother him all the time. What happens when I get an MBA from Yale? I land a very good job, set up a factory, then what? Was this the reason for which I was created, with an IQ of 150 plus so that I acquire some more degrees, run a successful business, get married, have children, enjoy luxuries, then die, that's it? He had experimented with death 4 times in his life, just to satisfy his curiosity, but now, despite severe depression, he did not try to end his life. In spite of thinking about death all the time, he did not want to approach it. However, if someone were to ask him if he wanted to live on, he would hesitate to answer in the positive. He did not want to live because he did not understand the meaning of life. And he did not want to die because he did not understand death. He was suspended in a vacuum, in limbo, somewhere in between being alive yet dead and dead yet alive. He was reaching the limits of hedonism moment by moment, this man with an exceptionally high IQ, who could not forget anything said or heard in his presence. Swathed in cigarette smoke, swigging beer, dining in plush restaurants, dancing away in nightclubs, spending nights with his girlfriend, there was just one question on his mind: is this the purpose of life? Riches and luxuries, elegant clothes, excellent food, the best facilities available for a life of 60 or 70 years, and then? He had no answer to that and then, but this query had upset the pattern of his life. He was gradually becoming an insomniac, and it was during this period that he found himself turning to religion. He had seen many people do this to escape depression and he did the same. He tried to read some books about Islam, but all the books went over his head. No word, no idea in them attracted him. He would force himself to read but put them away after a few pages. A little while later, he would pick them up again and then put them back. No, perhaps I should actually start praying, maybe that would help. Salaar tried to reason with himself, and one day when he was with S.A.W, he expressed this desire. I'll come with you, he told S.A.W, who was stepping out. But I'm going to say the Isha prayers, S.A.W reminded him. I know, he said, tying up his jogger laces. You'll come to the mosque? Saad was surprised. Yes. Salaar stood up. To pray? Yes, he replied. And there's no need to give me that look, after all I'm not an unbeliever. No you're not, but, anyway, come on and pray, said Saad. Then he suddenly shifted the topic. I've told you so often before to come along. Salaar did not reply, he quietly walked out with Saad. If you've come to the mosque today, then keep it up. Don't let this be your first and last visit, Saad continued. It was snowing when they stepped out. The mosque was a short distance from the residential building. It was in a house belonging to an Egyptian family. They had given the ground floor to be used as a mosque while the upper floor was used as their residence. Sometimes, the number of people praying there would be 20 to 25, but more often there were only 10 or 15. Saad apprised Salaar of all these details till they reached the mosque. Salaar walked silently beside him, somewhat unconcerned, but carefully avoiding skidding cars and watching his step on road lined with piles of snow. After walking for a few minutes, they turned into a side street and opening the door, Saad entered the house. The door was shut but not locked. Saad did not knock nor ask permission before entering, his movements were rather familiar. Salaar followed him in. Perform your ablutions. Saad turned to Salaar, and led him to the bathroom. The cold water on his hands made him shiver for a while. By the time Salaar had reached the last stage of the wuzu under Saad's supervision, the cold water had turned tepid. As he was running his hands over his head, he suddenly stopped. Saad thought that perhaps Salaar did not know the right way, so he directed him again. Rather vacantly, Salaar obeyed him. As his hands moved towards the nape of his neck, he felt the chain he was wearing and his glance fell on the mirror before him. Once again, his mind was somewhere else. Saad was saying something, but it did not register. The 10 people in the room were standing in 2 rows. Saad and Salaar joined the back row. The Imam began the prayer and along with everyone else, Salaar also recited the niyat for prayer. Does prayer really give you peace? He had found a young man in debate with Saad over prayer, about 2 weeks ago. It gives me peace, Saad had replied. I don't mean you, I mean everyone. Does it bring peace of mind to everyone? That depends on the degree of involvement people have, was Saad's response. Salaar stood aside, bored, listening to their argument, without any comment or interruption. He was consciously trying to enthuse himself on this topic. Peace? I really want to see what kind of peace it brings, he thought to himself as he bowed for ruku. Then he prostrated himself for the first sajda. His restlessness and anxiety suddenly increased. The words being intoned by the Imam were strange to his ears, the people around him were strangers, unknown, the environment was unnatural, and whatever he was doing there appeared to be sham, an act of hypocrisy. The burden on his heart and mind grew with each prostration, and he completed the last 4 stages with great difficulty. As he read the closing salam and turned, he saw tears roll down the face of the middle-aged man to his right. He wanted to just get up and flee from there, but he forced himself to stand up for another round of prayer and do this with as much interest as he could. This time I'll focus on every ayat that is read, he thought. Perhaps, this way. But his thoughts dispersed. The niyat was being recited. Salaar felt extremely dejected, the pressure on his mind seemed to increase. The recitation of the opening surah of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, began. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most beneficent. All praise is for the sustainer or cherisher of the universe, the most compassionate, the most beneficent. Salaar tried his best to concentrate. The Lord of the Day of Judgment. His attention wandered. It is to you that we bow in worship, it is you to whom we turn for help. He knew the translation of the Surah Al-Fatiha, he had read it a few days ago. Guide us to the straight path, he repeated to himself. The straight path? He wanted to run away. He made a last attempt to continue with the prayer. The path of those whom you bless. Once again, his mind receded. Not, the path of those on whom your wrath falls, and who go astray. He was in the last row, very quietly, he let down his arms and stepped out of line. I can't do this. I cannot pray. He was making a confession. He backed out slowly, unnoticeably as the others went into the ruku, and very swiftly, he came out of the room. Picking up his joggers, he stood absent-mindedly on the stairs, looking right and left. Shoes and socks in hand, he came down the stairs to the back wall of the building. There was another flight of stairs, covered by snow, and another door. It was dark as there was no light anywhere around. Bending down, he brushed the snow off a step, sat down and put on his shoes, then sat back against the door. His jacket hood was pulled over his head and his hands tucked into his pockets. On the road across, the traffic was thin. Salaar sat there watching the random cars and few pedestrians on the road. Sitting out there in the cold, foggy, night air, he felt more at peace than he was in the warm and cozy prayer room. Pulling a lighter out of his pocket, he lit it, trying to melt the snow on the steps. This entertained him for a while, but then he got bored and put the lighter away. As he straightened up, he realized there was a woman standing before him. He had not noticed her presence as he had been looking down. Even in the dark, he could see the smile playing on her face. She was wearing a fur coat which had been left artfully open to reveal a miniskirt and a skimpy blouse. Hands thrust in her coat pockets, she stood before Salaar very seductively. He surveyed her from head to toe. Her long, shapely legs were bare, the cold notwithstanding. He kept staring at her legs, highlighted by the neon lights behind her. She was wearing high-heeled boots and Salaar wondered how she could manage them on these snowed-down streets. I charge $50 an hour, she said very chummily in a very familiar way. Salaar looked up from her legs to her face, then back at her legs. This was the first time ever that he had felt sorry for a prostitute, wondering what had compelled her to parade half-naked in such snowbound weather when he had felt himself freezing despite his thick warm jeans. Okay, $40, she said, when he did not reply. She thought he found the rate too high, so reduced her price. Salaar knew that 40 was too much. On this street, he could get a girl for $20. This woman was around 35 or 40 years, and she looked around cautiously as she spoke to him. Salaar knew she was on the lookout for the police. Okay, 30, no more bargaining. Take it or leave it. She further reduced her rates, in view of Salaar's silence. Without a word, he fished out some notes from his pocket. He wasn't carrying a wallet, and held them out towards her. She snatched them. Here was a client who was, for the first time, giving her advance payment, and that too $50, when she had quoted less. Will you come with me or do you want me to accompany you? She asked very casually. Neither will I accompany you nor will you come with me. You can leave now, Salaar declared, looking beyond her at the shops across the road. The woman looked at him uncertainly. Really? Yes, he replied, unmoved. Then why did you give this? She held out the notes, still in her hand. So that you move out of my sight. I want to look at those shops and you're in the way. He spoke coldly. She burst out laughing. You do joke, don't you? You really want me to go? Yes. She kept looking at him for a few moments. Okay, thank you. Salaar saw her turn and cross the road, and without much interest, saw her walk to the other side. A man was standing there. Salaar started looking at the shops once more. It began to snow again, but he kept sitting there as the snow fell over him. He stayed there till the lights in the shops shut down, one by one. Then, dusting the snow off his clothes, he got up. If he hadn't been moving his legs from time to time, he would not have been able to stand on his feet. It was 2:30 in the morning. Pushing his hands into his pockets, and flexing his legs, he began to walk home. He knew that S.A.W must have searched for him and not finding him around must have gone home too. Where did you go off? S.A.W shouted, seeing Salaar, who walked in without saying a word. I'm asking you something, S.A.W remonstrated. He shut the door behind him and came after Salaar. I didn't go anywhere, replied Salaar, taking off his jacket. Do you know how long I searched for you, calling up God knows where and who? I was worried sick and was about to call the police, Where did you disappear, leaving the prayer midway? I told you, nowhere. Salaar was taking off his joggers. Then where were you all along? Saad was standing before him. Just there, on the footpath behind the mosque. What? You sat there all these hours, in the snow? Saad couldn't believe it. Yes. You are totally senseless. Saad was exasperated. Salaar was stretched out on the bed. Yes, really senseless, he agreed. Saad inquired if Salaar had eaten and asked him if he'd like to, but he refused, saying he wasn't hungry. Salaar just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Saad came and sat beside him. Whatever is the problem? Can you tell me? Salaar turned his neck to look at Saad. Nothing, no problem, he said flatly. I thought you had gone back to your apartment. I kept calling there, but got no response, Saad was complaining, but Salaar kept his gaze on the ceiling. It would have been better if I hadn't asked you to come along for prayers. Don't accompany me next time. Saad was really annoyed. He got up and wrapped up his work, then switching off the night lamp, he lay down on his bed. A little while later, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard Salaar call him. What is it? Saad looked at him. What is the straight path? This simple question nonplussed Saad. He turned to look at Salaar, who lay flat on the bed to his left. Straight path, it is the straight path. I know, but what is the straight path? Another question. The straight path means the path to goodness. What is goodness? The tone was still flat, unmoved. Goodness is good deeds. What are good deeds? Actions which are done for others, like helping someone, doing someone a favor. These are good deeds, and every good deed is goodness. A few hours ago, I gave $50 to a hooker on that footpath, though she was asking for just $30. Does this mean it was a good deed? Goodness? Saad felt like punching him in the face. He was a weird guy. Shut up and go to sleep, and let me sleep. He pulled up his blanket. So this was not an act of goodness? Salaar was astonished at Saad's annoyance. I told you, didn't I? Just shut up and go to sleep. Saad screamed at him. There's no need to get so worked up. I asked you a very ordinary question. Salaar spoke with great patience. Saad flared up. He switched on the lamp and sat up in bed. How can I explain to someone like you what is meant by straight path? Are crazy or ignorant? Or a non-Muslim? What are you, or nothing at all? You should know what this means. But how can a person who was out halfway through his prayers know what this means? I left halfway through the prayers because you say that it brings serenity, and I felt no sense of peace or calm, so I left. Salaar's comments, delivered in a calm and composed tone, further incensed Saad. You did not find peace because your place is not in the mosque. For you, peace is to be found in cinema halls, theaters, bars, and nightclubs. The mosque is not for you, so how could you find peace there? And you want me to tell you what the straight path is? Salaar kept looking fixedly at Saad. A person like you, who runs away from prayer, who drinks and indulges in fornication, can neither understand the straight path nor tread that path. Do you mean that those who imbibe alcohol and fornicate but do not turn away from prayer, that they also pray, understand straight path, and are on the straight path? Saad was speechless, as he knew what Salaar was referring to. Salaar fixed his gaze on his friend. You cannot understand these things, Salaar, Saad replied after a while. Another voice echoed in Salaar's ears, jolting him. Yes, indeed, I cannot understand. Turn off the light, I'm sleepy. Without another word, Salaar turned and closed his eyes. I expected to find you here. You've deliberately left the answering machine on. Why did you run away from my place? Saad expressed his displeasure. He was at Salaar's apartment the next morning. Salaar sleepily opened the door. I did not run away, you were asleep and I did not think it was right to disturb you. Salaar rubbed his eyes. When did you leave? Perhaps at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. That was no time to leave, Saad told him testily. And why did you sneak out like this? Salaar, instead of replying, went and lay face down on the sofa in the living room. Probably, you took offense at what I said. That's why I've come to apologize, Saad said, as he sat on the other sofa. What did you say to me? Salaar asked, turning to look at him. All that I said to you in annoyance last night, Saad was apologetic. Oh no, I don't take offense at such small things. You said no such thing for which you needed to come and apologize, Salaar replied nonchalantly. Then when did you take off so suddenly? Saad insisted. It's just that I felt depressed, so I came back here, and since I wanted to sleep, I left the answering machine on, Salaar explained calmly. Even so, I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. I've been regretting it very much since the morning. Oh, let it be, Salaar said, keeping his face still buried in the sofa. Salaar, what is the problem with you these days? Nothing. No, something is amiss, you are behaving rather strangely. Salaar suddenly turned around and, looking at Saad, asked him, for example, what is strange about me? Many things, you have become rather quiet, you get worked up about trivial things. Abad was telling me that you've stopped attending the university. And the most important is that you've started taking an interest in religion. The last observation brought a frown to Salaar's face. Interest in religion? You must be mistaken. I am not trying to get interested in religion, I am trying to find peace of mind because I am very depressed these days. Never in my life have I felt so low as I do now. It was to rid myself of this depression that I went to the mosque with you. Salaar was acerbic. Why are you depressed? Saad inquired. If I knew, I wouldn't be depressed, I'd have done something about it. Still, there must be a reason, one doesn't feel dejected just like that, Saad remarked. Salaar knew that Saad's words made sense, but he was not going to give Saad the chance to laugh at him by revealing the cause of his distress. I don't know about others, but it does happen to me without reason. He tried to avoid the issue. Try an antidepressant, Saad advised. I've had loads, they make no difference. Then see a psychiatrist. That I'll never do. I'm sick of seeing them and I'm not going to do so now, Salaar blurted out. Saad was surprised to hear this. His curiosity was aroused and he asked, why did you see them before? There were many reasons, let it be now. Salaar lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. Then you should pray regularly. I tried, but I found no comfort in prayer. Besides, I didn't know what I was reading in the prayer or understand why I was doing it. Then make an effort to find out. Salaar cut him short. Let's not start last night's argument about the straight path, it will make you angry again. No, it won't make me angry. When I do not know what the straight path is, how can I pray? Start praying and you'll get to know what it is. How? You'll avoid wrongdoing, you'll turn to good deeds yourself, Saad tried to explain. But I do not do anything that's wrong, nor do I have any desire to do good. My life is quite normal. You cannot gauge which of your actions is right and which is not until. Salaar interrupted him again. Right and wrong actions are not my concern. It's just that I am disturbed and that has nothing to do with my deeds. You indulge in all those things that make a person's life distressed. Such as? Salaar asked sarcastically. You eat pork. Oh, come on. What's pork got to do with it? Salaar got up and sat by Saad. Tell me, you pray regularly and a lot, what change has prayer brought about in you? I am not restless. Although by your formula you should be, because you also indulge in much wrongdoing, Salaar retorted. What wrongdoings? Give an example. You know very well. I don't need to repeat myself. No, I don't, so please repeat it, Saad was challenging him. Salaar kept looking at him for some time, then he replied. I don't believe, Saad, that any major changes can be brought about in life just by praying. Good deeds and a good character are not because of prayer alone. That's why I tell you to take some interest in your religion. Get some knowledge about Islam so that you can shed this misguided philosophy of yours and change your views, Saad interrupted. My views are not wrong. I haven't seen anyone more false, lying, hypocritical and deceitful than these religious people. I hope you won't mind, but this is the truth. I have come across 3 such persons who were great stalwarts of Islam, preaching and praying, but all 3 were fakes, Salaar spoke bitterly. The first was a girl, very pious, hijab observing, creating a lot of hype about her virtue and devoutness, and carrying on an affair with one boy while engaged to another. She ran away from home to be with her beloved, and when the need arose, she even took help from a person whom she hated. She thought nothing of exploiting him for her own ends. So much for Miss Piety and devotion. A mocking smile played across Salaar's lips. Then, I met this bearded man with a very religious appearance. He did not lift a finger to help the girl who had been begging him for support. He did not marry the girl who he had been fooling around with in the guise of love. Lately, I met him again, here in the US, and along with his faith, his beard had also vanished. Then Salaar laughed out. The third one is you. You don't eat pork, that's the one forbidden act you abstain from, the rest is all permissible to you. Lying, drinking alcohol, sex, going to clubs, backbiting, making fun of others, although you're very pious otherwise. You've got a beard and you drive people up the wall with your preaching, you insist on forcing people to pray. You keep quoting Islam at every step, this ayat, that hadith, that ayat, this hadith, that's all you have to say. You can't imagine how unbearable your sermons can be. When I look at your behavior, I'm least impressed. There's not much difference between us, with your religious appearance and ceaseless talk of Islam, you're doing all that I do without a beard and without religion. What great revolution has prayer brought in your life, except the misconception that you're headed for paradise while the rest of us go to hell? If I had not found this anomaly in your words and deeds, I'd never have said this to you. But I do have a request, please do not try to attract people to religion, because I think you don't know much about it either. Now, please do not mind all I have said, concluded Salaar. Saad was practically mute with shock. After a while, Saad responded. I agree that I make mistakes. But Allah forgives His beings. I never claim to be a perfect Muslim or to find a place in paradise. But if I do something good and instruct others towards goodness, then I consider it a divine mission. Saad, don't burden yourself with the responsibility for others. Try to reform yourself before you set out to reform others, so that you're not called a hypocrite. As far as God's forgiveness is concerned, then if He can forgive you, so can He forgive us. If you think that you can reduce our sins by preaching Islam and gain closeness to God, despite your sins, it's not so. Improve your own track record, and look to yourself instead of worrying about others. Let us be as we are. Salaar's words were harsh, but he poured out his thoughts to Saad. When he had finished his speech, Saad got up and left. After that day, he never spoke to Salaar on the topic of religion. After a long time, he went to a restaurant for dinner that weekend. The waiter took his order, and then Salaar passed the time looking at the road beyond the window. Sitting by the French windows, he felt as if he was actually out on the footpath. His attention was diverted by the sound of a woman sobbing. Turning around, he saw a girl and a boy on the table behind him. The girl was sobbing softly and wiping her eyes with a tissue. The boy was patting her hand to console her perhaps. The restaurant was so small and the tables so close that he could have heard their conversation, but that was not his intention and he turned away. A wave of displeasure coursed through him, he disapproved of such carryings on. He had come to this place in search of a peaceful evening and this incident put him in a bad mood. The couple behind him was Russian and they were talking in their own language. Salaar began looking out of the window again, but one ear was cocked towards the muffled sobs and quiet dialogue behind him. He turned towards them once again, and this time the girl caught his eye. Those few moments seemed endless. The girl's swollen eyes and unhappy face brought back the memory of another face and eyes reddened with weeping, Imama Hashim's. The waiter brought his order and placed the food before him. Salaar took a few sips of water and tried to brush away the memories. He took a few deep breaths and the waiter looked at him curiously, Salaar was busy taking in the scene outside the window. It's a wonderful day and I've come here to enjoy some happy moments, to have a good meal. Then I plan to go to the movies. I should banish all thoughts about that girl. She was crazy, she talked rubbish and I should have no regrets about her in any way. How should I know where she has gone? It was all her own doing. I was just playing along with her. Had she contacted me, I'd have divorced her. Unconsciously, his regret surfaced as he tried to justify his actions regarding Imama. The weeping of the girl on the table behind now stabbed his mind. I want to change my table, he told the waiter, rather roughly. Why, sir? The waiter was quite surprised. Or else change their table, Salaar gestured towards the couple behind. It wasn't clear if the waiter had understood Salaar's problem, but anyway, he seated Salaar at a corner table. Salaar was relieved that he could not hear her sniffling, but now she was almost facing him. He caught sight of her again as he lifted the first morsel to his lips. Suddenly, everything seemed tasteless, unappetizing. Definitely, it was his state of mind and not the food. The restaurant was known for its cuisine. People cannot thank him enough for the blessings they enjoy. This ability to taste food, to enjoy good food is such a blessing, that I can savor good food and relish it. There are many who are deprived of this bounty. Her voice was echoing in his mind and this was the limit. Like a volcano, he erupted. Banging the spoon forcefully on his plate, he rose up from his seat, shouting. Shut up! Just shut up! A hush fell on the restaurant. You bitch! You bastard! Just shut up! His face was crimson. Why the hell don't you get out of my mind? He screamed, holding on to his temples. I'll kill you if I see you again. He shouted again. Then he had a glass of water and the place seemed to come into focus, the restaurant, the people there. He saw the waiter approach him with concern. Are you feeling all right, sir? Without another word, Salaar pulled out his wallet, put some dollar bills on the table and left the restaurant. It was not Imama, it was a bad spirit that haunted him wherever he went. It would be her face or her voice, and if it was not these then it was his regret. When he tried to forget one thing about her then something else would surface. Sometimes he would get so volatile and agitated that were she to appear before him, he would strangle her or shoot her. He hated everything about her. Those few hours spent driving her overnight had overshadowed his life completely. But why are you coming? Salaar was irritated as he talked to his elder brother, who had called to tell him of his arrival in New Haven a few days later. Had Salaar's life been following a routine pattern, he would have welcomed this news. But he was going through a bad patch and Kamran's arrival at this point annoyed him. He couldn't hide his annoyance. What do you mean by why am I coming? To see you, of course, what else? Kamran was somewhat taken aback by Salaar's tone. And Dad also told me to look you up. Salaar heard him out with clenched teeth. Pick me up from the airport. I'll give you the flight details a day ahead. After some banal conversation, they hung up. 4 days later, Salaar received Kamran at the airport. He was shocked to see Salaar. Have you been ill? Asked Kamran. No, I'm fine. Salaar tried to smile. You don't look it. Kamran's concern grew. Salaar used to look a person in the eye when he spoke. Now he was shying away. Kamran observed Salaar as he was driving. He used to be a very rash driver, to the extent that you sat with him at your own risk, but now he was driving very carefully. Kamran felt this was a positive change in his brother, however it was the only positive change. The other changes that Kamran saw were worrying him. How are your studies coming along? Doing well. Throughout the trip, these were the kind of responses Kamran got from Salaar. When they got to his apartment, Kamran was appalled as he followed Salaar in. Is this your apartment, Salaar? My God! Salaar used to be very organized, keeping everything in place, but this orderliness was nowhere in view. Everything was in a chaos, his clothes and shoes lay strewn about, books, newspapers and magazines were scattered all over, the kitchen was in a messy state and the bathroom worse still. Kamran surveyed the apartment, shocked by what he saw. "How long has it been since you cleaned this place?" "I'll do it right now," Salaar replied coldly. "You were not used to such living, what happened now?" Kamran was most concerned. His glance fell on an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. He picked it up and began to sniff the contents. Salaar gave his brother a piercing look but said nothing. Kamran replaced the ashtray in disgust and turned to him. "Salaar, what are you up to this time? Come clean, what's the problem? What's going on? Are you into drugs?" "No, I'm not taking anything." His reply angered Kamran, who gripped Salaar's shoulders and dragged him before the bathroom mirror. "Look at yourself, you look like a drug addict and you act like one. Raise your eyes, Salaar, look at your face." Kamran was tugging at his collar. Even without seeing his reflection, Salaar knew what he must be looking like. What else could one see but for the dark rings around his eyes and the overgrown stubble on his face? The image was completed by the spots and pimples on his face and his dry flaking lips, the result of endless coffee and cigarettes. He had stopped shaving because of his acne-ridden skin. Upset, he jerked himself free of Kamran's hold and tried to get away without a glance at the mirror. "You look absolutely despicable, cursed." Cursed was a word that Kamran often used, but Salaar had never felt it so keenly as he did now. He was incensed. "Yes, despicable and cursed, so what?" He stood defiantly in front of Kamran. "When I'm telling you that I do not take drugs, you should believe me." "Believe you?" "Ha!" Sarcasm dripped from Kamran's tone. Teeth clenched in fury, Salaar continued to clear up the room without a word. "Are you attending classes at the university?" Salaar felt a warning bell ring. "I am." Kamran was not satisfied. "Come with me to the hospital, I want you to have a complete check-up. If this is what you've come for, it is better you return. I'm not a kindergarten child, I can look after myself." Kamran did not reply. He joined Salaar in putting things in order. Salaar breathed a sigh of relief. He thought that this argument had come to an end, but he was mistaken. Kamran extended his stay in New Haven by a week. During this period, Salaar attended classes regularly. Kamran, on the other hand, met with Salaar's friends and his professors. He learned from Salaar's friends of his failure in the semester. This was a shock for Kamran. Anything could be expected of Salaar, but to fail so poorly, when till lately he had been breaking academic records and topping the university. This time, Kamran did not discuss anything with Salaar. Instead, he called up his father in Pakistan and briefed him on the situation. Once again, the earth slipped away from under Sikandar's feet. Salaar was maintaining his old record. Every couple of years, he presented his father with a new set of problems. The Hashim Mubin and Imama business was about that old now. "Don't talk to him about this now," suggested Kamran. "The university is going to close down for the holidays, so call him home to Pakistan for a while. Then Mom should accompany him back and stay here till he completes his studies." Sikandar followed Kamran's advice. A few days before the vacation commenced, he arrived in New Haven. The sight of Salaar left Sikandar with knots in his stomach, but he did not argue with him. He simply asked Salaar to come home for the holidays. Salaar made excuses about studies and classes, but Sikandar ignored his demurral and booked his seat for the flight home. Against his will, Salaar was brought back to Pakistan. It was 1 in the morning when they reached Pakistan. Sikandar and Taiba retired to their room. He went to his room. He was looking at it after nearly 1.5 years. Everything was as he had left it. He changed, switched off the light and lay down. He had slept during the flight, so he did not feel sleepy now. Perhaps it was also the time difference. "Looks like I'll gradually become an insomniac," he said as he lay in the dark room. Tossing and turning for some time, he sat up, then he went to the window and drew the curtains open. Across the wide lawn was Hashim Mubin's house on the other side. Salaar had never really taken notice of that house in all these years, but now he surveyed the building by the lights from the first floor. The memories came flooding back. He drew the curtains shut. "Were Wasim's folks able to find Imama?" he asked Parveen the next day. She gave him a doubtful look. No, sir, no trace of her. They looked everywhere but there was no trace of her. They still suspect you, do you know? Salma madam curses you. Salaar kept staring at her. The police questioned all the house servants too, but never did I utter a word. They also sacked me and my daughter, but they called us back later on. They keep asking me about you. Perhaps they re-employed us so that I could pass on news about your house to them. But, sir, I make excuses and get away with it. Parveen went on extending her tale. Is the police still searching for her? Salaar interjected. Yes, sir, they are still looking. I don't know much because they keep these things from the servants. They don't mention Imama madam before us, but one catches snippets of conversation. Salaar, sir, don't you know anything about Imama madam? Parveen asked quite suddenly. How should I know? He fixed his gaze on her. I was just asking, just like that, because you were friendly with her. I thought you might know. Those papers you once sent through me, who were they for? Her curiosity was getting dangerous. Those were property papers, for this house, I transferred it to her name. Parveen's mouth fell open. Then she composed herself and said, But sir, this house belongs to Sikandar, sir. Yes, but I didn't know it then. Have you told anyone that you took the papers to her? Parveen touched her ears. Never, sir. I did not tell Sikandar, sir, anything. And it's best for you not to say anything, just keep your mouth shut. If my father gets to know he'll throw you out lock, stock and barrel, you know his temper. Now leave, Salaar spoke tersely. Parveen left without a word. On the weekends, sometimes, he used to go hiking in the Margalla Hills. That wasn't a weekend, but he felt like going anyway. As usual, he parked the car at the foot of the hills, and a small bag slung over his shoulder, he went off. He turned back, giving himself enough time to get to the car before dark. It would have taken him 2 hours, so he came onto a path used by many people. He had barely gone a few yards when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw 2 boys. They were fairly far from him but were moving fast. He turned away and continued his trek downwards. By their appearance the boys did not look shady. Dressed in jeans and t-shirts they looked like anyone else, but as he walked he felt someone quite close behind him. He suddenly turned and was dumbstruck. They were facing him, revolvers in hand. Hands up or we'll shoot you, one of them shouted. Salaar lifted up his arms. One of them went behind him dragging Salaar, tried to push him to the ground. Salaar tottered on his feet but did not lose his balance. This way. Salaar moved in the shown direction without putting up any resistance. They wanted to get him away from the path so that they were not confronted by anyone coming that way. The boys propelled him towards the bushes and the undergrowth. Kneel down, one of them harshly ordered. Salaar obeyed them. He knew that they would snatch his belongings, cell phone, money, and would let him off. He did not want to do any such thing that would provoke them into harming him. One of the boys went behind Salaar and took the backpack off his back. There was a camera, a few rolls of film, battery cells, a pair of binoculars, a first aid kit, water, some snacks, and his wallet in it. The boy who had taken the bag fished through the items in it, then he surveyed the contents of the wallet, some cash and his credit card. Next, he pulled out the packet of tissues and the first aid kit. Now get up, the boy ordered Salaar. He stood there, arms still raised. The boys went behind and began to probe the pockets of his Bermudas. He pulled out the car keys. Good. He has a car. Now, Salaar was beginning to get worried. Look, you can take my stuff, but leave the car. For the first time, he addressed them. Why? Why leave the car? Are you my cousin that I should leave the car with you? The boy spoke roughly. Even if you tried to take the car, you'd have many problems. There are all kinds of locks in it. That's our problem, not yours. The other boy stepped up and snatched Salaar's sunglasses. Take off your joggers. My joggers, what for? Salaar looked at him in surprise. But the boy, instead of replying, slapped Salaar with all his might. Salaar staggered at the blow. "Don't ask again, just take off your joggers." Salaar gave him a baleful look. The boys cocked their revolvers at him menacingly. The one who had hit Salaar slapped him again on the other cheek. "Stare again, will you?" "Your joggers," he demanded without looking at him. Salaar slowly took off his shoes. He had only his socks. "Now, your shirt." Salaar wanted to protest, but he wasn't ready for any more beating. If they were not armed, Salaar could easily have taken care of them as he was physically bigger and stronger. But unarmed, he felt vulnerable. He took off his shirt and held it out. "Throw it down." Salaar did so. The boy then pulled something out of his trouser pocket. It looked like a ball of thin nylon twine. Salaar at once understood their intention and was very disturbed. It was getting on towards sunset and shortly, it would be dark. How would he get out of there? "Look here, don't tie me up. You can take my bag and my car, I won't tell a soul," he said defensively. Without a word, the boy swung around and punched Salaar in the stomach. Salaar doubled up with pain and a stifled cry escaped him. "No suggestions." The boy then pushed Salaar hard to one side. Salaar, feeling excruciating pain, blindly did as he was ordered. The boy sat Salaar against a tree trunk and very deftly started to tie his wrists behind the slim trunk with the twine. The other boy stood at some distance calmly looking around but with the revolver aimed at Salaar. After tying up his hands well, the boy came in front and took off Salaar's socks and with the pair of scissors from the first aid kit started to cut out strips from Salaar's shirt. He, again, with great dexterity, tied up Salaar's ankles with the strips. Then he opened the box of tissues and emptied it. "Open your mouth." Salaar knew what he was going to do. He was mentally cursing the boy, who stuffed all the tissues one by one in his mouth. Then passing the last remaining strip from the shirt across Salaar's mouth, like a horse's bit, he tied him to the tree trunk. The other boy was now calmly closing the bag. A few minutes later they had both vanished from the scene. The moment they left, Salaar started to make efforts to untie himself, but he soon realized that he had landed in great trouble. The boy had tied him up with great expertise and he could not wriggle himself free. Nor could he loosen the twine. The more he tried, the more the twine cut into his flesh. He was in a very bad state. He could neither call out for help nor could he in any other way draw attention to himself. Around him, there were tall bushes and with the growing darkness it would have been a miracle for someone to stumble on him. He was left only with his knee-length Bermuda shorts and the night was getting chilly. At home, nobody knew that he had come here hiking. Even when he would be missed, how could anyone have found him, all tied up, in the dark in this thick forest? After half an hour's effort, when he was able to loosen and then undo the strips around his ankles, the sun had completely set. If the moon had not appeared he would not have been able to see his hands and feet and his surroundings. By now, the noise of people and traffic had almost completely died down. Around him was the cacophony of insects. He could feel the abrasions from the neck to the waist as he was tied to the tree trunk. The twine had cut into his wrists at the back of the tree and he was unable to move his hands any more. He could not bear the stinging pain in his wrists. By now, the tissues which had been stuffed into his mouth had become pulp and he had started to move the strip in his mouth, but he was unable to call out, because he could neither swallow nor spit out the softened tissues. There were so many tissues that he was unable to chew them like gum. He was beginning to shiver. In this condition, he would have been surely dead by the morning, if he had not either died of fear or been bitten to death by some poisonous creature. His skin was crawling with small insects which were repeatedly biting him. He was able to shake off the annoying insects from his exposed legs but was unable to do this from the rest of his body. He wondered, if besides these small insects what other creatures he would have to contend with, and if there were scorpions and snakes. As time passed, his condition deteriorated. Why has this happened to me? What wrong have I done, and if I were to die, nobody would even find my corpse. It would be devoured by the insects and the wild animals. He pityingly thought. His condition took a turn for the worse. He was gripped by numbing fear. So, will I die like this, here, in this state, naked, unaccounted for, my people wouldn't even know about me. Is this to be my fate? His heart missed beats. Suddenly, he felt so afraid of death that he found it difficult to breathe. He felt as though death stood before him to see how his breath went out, bit by bit. Overcoming his pain, he tried once more to free his wrists. His arms hurt excruciatingly. After struggling for 15 minutes, he stopped. He then realized that the strip across his mouth had loosened and that he could get it out by manipulating his neck, which he did. Next, he spat out the tissues. He inhaled deeply for several minutes and then kept yelling aloud as he could, for help. He was hysterical. After continuously shouting for half an hour, his courage and voice packed up. He was out of breath, as though he had run several miles, but even so no one answered his call for help. The wounds on his wrists were hurting unbearably, and now the insect stinging his face and neck also. He did not know what overtook him, but suddenly he burst out crying aloud uncontrollably like a child. For the first time in his life he was crying with such intensity. Perhaps, never before had he felt so helpless, and tied as he was to the tree trunk, he realized that he did not want to die. He was being engulfed by death the way he felt he had been in New Haven. He did not remember for how long he cried out hysterically. Then his tears started to dry. Perhaps he was so tired that he could not even cry. Dog-tired, he leaned against the tree trunk and shut his eyes. His shoulders and arms hurt so much that he felt that they would be permanently paralyzed. I have never hurt anybody like this, but why has this happened to me? Tears started to flow again from his eyes. Salaar. My life is already beset with problems, don't try to increase them. My life is already difficult, and with the passage of each day it is becoming even more difficult. At least try to understand my predicament and don't increase my difficulties. Leaning against the tree trunk, Salaar opened his eyes. His throat was drying up. Deep down below, far, far away, he could see the lights of Islamabad. Am I trying to increase your difficulties, me? My dear Imama. I am besought with your problems. I am trying to put an end to them. Consider, living with me, what a good and protected life you could have. Salaar bit his lip. Salaar. Give me a divorce, she had exclaimed. Sweetheart. You go get it from the court, as you have already said you would. He was now quietly staring at the distant lights. He could discern his own image and that of someone else too in a mirror. I had only joked with Imama, he mumbled. I did not want to hurt her. His words appeared hollow to him. Heaven knows to whom he was trying to clarify. For a long time, he stared at the lights of Islamabad, then his eyes grew dim. I accept I've done some wrong. His voice was a hoarse whisper. I had intentionally tried creating problems for her. I tricked her, but I made a mistake and I am remorseful. I know that by my not giving her a divorce and by lying about Jalal, she must have had to face a lot of difficulties. I am really sorry for all that happened, but apart from this I have not hurt anyone. And he began to weep again. My God, if I get out of this, I'll seek out Imama and divorce her, and I'll never trouble her again. I'll also tell her the truth about Jalal. Please, God, just release me. He was now sobbing uncontrollably. For the first time, he realized how Imama must have felt when he had refused to divorce her. Perhaps, she had felt her hands were tied, the way he felt now. Sitting there, he could, for the first time, imagine Imama's helplessness, fear, and pain. He had lied to her about Jalal's marriage and he still remembered the heartbroken expression on her face. He actually enjoyed seeing her in distress. She had cried almost all the way from Islamabad to Lahore that night, and it had amused him. Now he could appreciate her mental and emotional state. That dark night, traveling in that car, she might not have been able to see ahead or behind her. The only refuge for which she had left home was Jalal's house, but Salaar would not let her go there. At that hour of night, in that pervading darkness, he could feel Imama's fear and forebodings which had wrenched her heart. I am sorry, indeed, I am sorry, but what can I do? If I see her again I'll apologize to her, I'll help her as far as I can, but now, at this time I can't do anything. If I have ever done any good, God, get me out of this misery. Oh God! Please, please, please. With tears streaming, he tried to recall the good deeds that he had done. It occurred to him for the first time that, till now he had not done any good in his life. No good deed that he could present before God and, in return, ask Him for his release. He was gripped by another fear. He had never given in charity, as he did not believe in it. He did tip in hotels and restaurants, but never gave any alms to a beggar. At school or college, when funds were collected for various causes, he would neither collect nor donate. I don't believe in charity, he would coldly expound. I don't have spare cash to throw about. He had continued with this attitude in New Haven also. This niggardliness was not just limited to charity, he did not believe in helping out anybody. He could not recall any instance where he might have helped someone. He had only helped Imama, but after what he had done to her he could not call it a good deed. He also did not pray regularly. Perhaps, as a child, he might have gone a few times for Eid prayers with Sikandar, but even that was more a ritual than worship. He remembered the night in New Haven when he had absconded midway from the Isha prayer, and he also remembered the $50 he had given to the hooker. Probably, that was the one instance when he had felt pity for someone. He tried hard to recall any good that he might have done, but in vain. And then he was reminded of his misdeeds. What had he not done? His tears and supplications immediately stopped. The slate was clean. If he had died in that state, he would not have been dealt with unfairly. If, at the age of 22, with an IQ level of 150 plus, a photographic memory, and after thinking for several hours a person is unable to recall even one good deed that he had done, then how could he expect God to bail him out of his predicament? What is next to ecstasy, he had said whilst taking cocaine in his teens, asked his friend, who was also imbibing it. More ecstasy, he had said. Then, taking some more, he turned to look at Salaar. There is no end to ecstasy. It is preceded by pleasure and followed by more ecstasy. He went on in his stupor, but Salaar was not convinced. No, it does end. What happens when it ends? When it really ends? His friend looked at him strangely. You know it yourself, don't you? You have been through it off and on. Salaar, instead of replying, again started taking cocaine. The twine biting into the flesh of his wrists was now speaking, pain. What is next to pain? He had asked Imama Hashim jeeringly that night. Nothingness. A rope-like thing had dropped on his body. It slithered over his head, face, down his neck, chest, stomach, and then slid away swiftly. Salaar choked his scream as his body shook. It was a snake that had slithered off him without biting him. His body was soaked wet with sweat and shivering like a fever-ridden patient. Nothingness, the voice was clear. And what is next to nothingness? The response was a sarcastic, contemptuous smile. Hell. She had said the same thing. He had been there, tied up, for the last 8 hours in that desolate, dark and terrifying solitude. He had been shouting for help with all his might for an hour and his throat had gone hoarse, unable to speak another word. He was suspended between nothingness and hell. Perhaps, he was about to enter nothingness and was about to reach hell. Don't you feel afraid to ask what would come after hell? What can come after hell, after a person dies, condemned and sentenced, what remains of him that you are so keen to know? Salaar looked around himself with terrified eyes. What was that place? His grave or hell or a glimpse of it in this life, hunger, thirst, utter helplessness, crawling insects whom he could not stop from biting him, almost paralyzed hands and feet, wounds on his back and wrists getting worse by the moment, whether it was fear or terror, but he had begun screaming like a madman. His screams were renting the air, hysterical and frightening screams, apparently without purpose. He had never felt such fear in his whole life. Never. He began to see demons and apparitions around him. He felt that a blood vessel in his brain might burst or he might have a nervous breakdown. Then his screams slowly subsided and his throat was completely choked. He heard strange muffled sounds, he was sure that he was dying. His heart was failing, or else he was losing his mental balance. And suddenly then, at that moment, the twine tying his wrists at the back of the tree loosened. His faltering senses seemed to jolt back to life. Biting his lower lip, he moved his hands. The twine began to loosen further. Perhaps it had broken due to the constant friction with the tree trunk. He moved his hands a little more and realized that he was free of the trunk. Unbelieving, he straightened his arms. Waves of pain shot through them. Have I been saved? He wondered as he looked uncertainly at the outlines of his arms and hands in the darkness. Why? What for? His mind was going numb. He removed from his neck the strip of cloth that had first been tied across his mouth. The movements made him groan as his arms hurt very badly, so badly that he felt he might not be able to use them again. His legs were also going numb. He tried to stand up, but fell to the ground. A whimper escaped him. He tried to stand up again with the help of his hands and knees, and this time he succeeded. The two boys had taken his joggers and his watch as well. His socks were lying somewhere around. He could have felt around for them in the dark, but he would have had to use his arms and hands. He was incapable of doing this, neither physically nor mentally. He only wanted to get out of there at any cost. Stumbling through the dark, he somehow got through the bushes, bruised and scratched, till he reached the road where the boys had accosted him. He walked down barefoot. The pebbles and stones hurt his feet, but this was nothing compared to the physical and mental ordeal he had been through. He did not know what time it was, but he was aware that more than half the night was over. He did not know how much time it took him to walk down or how he did it. He only knew that he had wept loudly all the way. He did not bother to look at the state he was in, even in the light on the roads of Islamabad. He did not stop, nor did he ask for help. Crying, he stumbled along on the footpath. A police patrol car saw him first and stopped near him. The constables got down in front of him and stopped him. For the first time, he came to his senses, but he could not stop his tears. They questioned him, but what could he say? Within the next 15 minutes he was in a hospital where he was provided first aid. They were asking him his home address, but his throat was choked. He was unable to tell them anything. With a swollen hand, he scribbled his home phone number and address. How much longer is he to be kept here? Not long. As soon as he regains consciousness, we'll check him up again and discharge him. His injuries are not grave. He only needs complete rest at home. His mind was moving from the unconscious to the conscious state. The meaningless sounds were becoming comprehensible. He was beginning to recognize the voices. One voice was that of Sikandar. The other voice must have been of some doctor. Salaar very slowly opened his eyes. He was at once blinded by the light. The room was very brightly lit. He felt that it might be the private clinic of their family doctor. He had stayed in a room like this once before too, and a cursory glance was enough for confirmation. Now, his brain was functioning perfectly normally. He again became aware of the pain in various parts of his body, even though he was in a very soft and comfortable bed. He was not in the clothes he had on in the government hospital where he had first been taken. He was in other clothes, and his body may also have been cleaned up with water, because his arms exposed from the half-sleeved shirt did not show any dirt or grit. His wrists were wrapped in bandages and his arms bore a lot of small marks. His arms and hands were swollen. He could imagine innumerable such marks on his face and other parts of his body. He felt that one of his eyes was also swollen and his jaws were also aching, but worst of all was his throat. There was a drip in his arm which was about to finish. The doctor was the first to see him regain consciousness. He was not their family doctor, perhaps he was some other doctor working with their family physician. He beckoned Sikandar towards him. Has he come to? He saw Taiba, who was seated on a sofa, move towards him, but Sikandar remained motionless. The doctor checked Salaar's pulse. How are you feeling now? Salaar wanted to say something, but his voice failed him. He could only open his mouth. The doctor repeated his question, but Salaar shook his head negatively. Try speaking. Perhaps, the doctor was already aware of the problem with his throat. Salaar again shook his head. The doctor picked up a torch-like instrument from the tray that the nurse was holding. Open your mouth. Salaar parted his aching jaws. The doctor examined his throat for some time and then switched off the torch. The throat needs to be thoroughly examined, he said to Sikandar, turning towards him. Then he pushed a writing pad and pen toward Salaar. The nurse, by now, had removed the drip from his arm. Sit up and tell what's happened to your throat. He did not have difficulty in sitting up. The nurse had put the pillow behind his back. He kept thinking, holding the pad in his hand. What happened to you, to your throat, your body, your brain? He was unable to write anything. He kept looking at the pen held in his swollen fingers. He remembered what had happened to him. He remembered his screams which had rendered him unable to speak. What am I to write? That on a hill I was robbed and tied up, that for a few hours I was lowered into a grave to find the answers to my questions. What is next to ecstasy? He kept looking at the crisp white paper and then briefly jotted down what had occurred. The doctor, holding the pad, quickly went through the 7 or 8 sentences and pushed the pad toward Sikandar. You should immediately contact the police so that the car can be retrieved. As it is, a lot of time has been lost. Heaven knows how far they've escaped with the car, the doctor sympathetically advised Sikandar, who glanced at the writing pad. Yes, I'll contact the police. They two talked for some time about the checkup of Salaar's throat, after which the doctor and the nurse left. The moment they left, Sikandar flung the writing pad at Salaar's chest. Keep this pack of lies to yourself. Do you think that I'll ever believe you? No, never. Sikandar was infuriated. This may be your latest adventure, another suicide attempt. Salaar wanted to say, for God's sake. It isn't true, but he looked at him unable to speak. What am I to tell the doctor? That he is in the habit of creating such situations, that he was born to create such problems? Salaar had never seen Sikandar so angry. Maybe, they were really fed up with him. Taiba stood by silently. Every year, there's a new drama, new trouble. What sin have we committed in having you? Sikandar was convinced that this was some part of a new adventure. Salaar's injuries could not be taken as proof of a dacoity, particularly when there was no witness, as the boy had tried to take his own life 4 times in the past. Salaar recalled the story about crying wolf. Some tales are indeed true. His constant lying had cost him the confidence of others. Maybe, he had lost everything: respect in the eyes of others, self-confidence, pride, honor. He had reached the lowest point in all. It was a long time since a new drama had been created, so you thought, why deprive my parents? It was long since they had been embarrassed and humiliated, it was time to give them a fresh blow. Sikandar, maybe what he's saying is correct. You should at least inform the police about the car, Taiba said after reading the message on the pad. Do you think he is telling the truth? Has he ever told the truth? I don't believe even a word of his rubbish. This son of yours will have me hanged one day and you're telling me to go report to the police? Make a laughing stock of myself? He must have done something with the car too, maybe sold it to someone or disposed it off somewhere. Now, he was really abusing Salaar, who had never been spoken to abusively before. Sikandar would only scold him, but even so Salaar would react vehemently. Of all the 4 brothers, he was the only one who could not even stand being reprimanded, and Sikandar would be very cautious speaking to him, because he would overreact. But, today, Salaar did not react even to his abuses. He could understand how his father despaired of him. For the first time, sitting on the bed, he was trying to understand his parents' predicament. What had they not provided him? They had fulfilled his every wish without his having to utter a word. And what had he been giving them in return? What was he meting out to them now? Mental anguish, worry, pain? Apart from him, none of his brothers or his sister had ever caused them problems. He was the only one who. Someday, because of you, we both may have to commit suicide. You would then be at peace with yourself. Last night, tied up on that hill, for the first time he had longed for his parents. He realized for once how much he needed them. What would he do without them? Who would worry for him except them? For once, Sikandar's words had not hurt his pride. He was always close to Sikandar and he quarreled the most with him too. I don't want to see your face again. I want to have you dumped back in the place about which you are lying. Now stop it, Sikandar, Taiba remonstrated. Why should I stop? Why doesn't he stop? Why doesn't he take pity on us and stop his antics? Has he been sent to make our lives hell on earth? Sikandar said with greater agitation. In a while, the police people who'd found him on the street will be here to record his statement, and he'd give them the cock and bull story that he, the innocent soul that he is, had been robbed. It would have been better if indeed he had been robbed and been thrown down the hill, so that my problems were over. Salaar began to weep uncontrollably. He was crying with his hands clasped. Sikandar and Taiba were taken aback. For the first time, they were seeing him cry, and that too with his hands clasped, as if pleading. What was he doing? What did he want? What was he saying? Sikandar stood absolutely still. Taiba sat next to him on the bed and embracing him, tried to pat his back in consolation, and he, like a child, clung to her. Sikandar, standing at the foot of the bed, suddenly felt that, perhaps, this time he was not lying, that indeed something might have happened to him. Clinging to Taiba, he was crying uncontrollably like a little child. Taiba, trying to console him, herself started to cry. Let alone small things, he had not shed tears over big issues too, so what had happened that his tears did not cease that day? Standing there, Sikandar had a change of heart. What if he was really tied up there all night? He had been up all night waiting for Salaar and fuming at him. He thought that he had again gone off gallivanting in the car to Lahore or someplace else. He was getting anxious, but he knew Salaar's behavior and, so, was more angry than worried. He had gone to bed at about 3 in the morning when he was informed on the phone by the police. Sikandar had gone to the hospital and found him in a very serious condition, but he was not prepared to believe that he was a victim of some incident. He knew that he would, from to time, inflict pain on himself. For a person who would cut his wrists, plunge his bike into oncoming traffic on a one-way street, take an overdose of sleeping pills, or tie himself up and jump backwards into the water, it was not difficult for him to get himself into such a state. His body was swollen where the insects had bitten him. In places, his skin had turned purple. His feet were also badly injured. Similar was the state of his wrists, neck and back, and there were wounds on his jaws. In spite of all this, Sikandar was certain that this was his own doing. Perhaps, even if Salaar had been able to speak and convince him, he would never have been moved, but seeing him weep uncontrollably he had begun to believe that he was telling the truth. He came out of the room and contacted the police on his mobile. An hour later, he came to know that a red sports car had been found and the 2 boys driving it had been taken into custody. This happened during a routine check for the car's papers, and the police, suspecting at the boys' nervousness, nabbed them. They did not say from whom the car had been snatched. They had insisted that they found the car abandoned and took it for a joy ride. Since no FIR had been registered for the car, it was difficult to verify the boys' statement. But shortly after filing the FIR, Sikandar had learnt about the recovery of the car, and now he was in real anxiety about Salaar. Sikandar and Taiba did not bring Salaar home that night. He stayed at the hospital. By the next day, his body ache and swelling had considerably lessened. Around 11 in the morning, his parents came to take him home. Before that, 2 policemen had come and taken a long written statement from Salaar about the events that befell him in Margala. Entering his room with his parents, Salaar was embarrassed, for the first time, about the life-size posters of nude models plastered all over his windows. Taiba and Sikandar had come into his room many times and the sight of those posters was neither new nor objectionable for them. Now rest. I have had fruit and juices kept in the fridge for you. Help yourself if you feel hungry or send for the servant, he'll serve you, said Taiba. Salaar was on his bed. His parents stayed with him a while and then drawing the window curtains shut, asked him to sleep and left the room. As soon as they had gone, Salaar sat up. Then he locked the bedroom door and drew the curtains open. Swiftly, he began to pull down the posters, pictures, cutouts, all that adorned his windows and walls. He piled them up and put them in the bathtub. When he switched on the bathroom light, he caught sight of his face in the mirror, swollen and bruised as he had expected it to be. He went back to the room where several pornographic magazines also lay around. He gathered them all up and dumped the lot in the bathtub. Then, one by one, he took the videos from the racks and began to pull out their tapes. In no time, his carpet was covered by a mangled heap of videotapes. He trashed the cases and scooping up the heap of tapes threw them into the bathtub too. Then picking up a lighter, he set the tapes alight. As the sparks turned into flames, the bathroom was filled with acrid smoke. He turned on the exhaust fan and opened the bathroom windows to clear the air. He was burning this heap of pornographic trash because he wanted safety from the flames of hell that would embrace him. The fire was consuming the paper and plastic as though it had been created for the flames that he stood watching the fire without even blinking as though he stood on the edge of hell. A night ago he had stood on the hill watching the lights of Islamabad below and thinking that it was the last night of his life and he would never see the Islamabad lights again. In that hysterical condition, he had been shouting at the top of his voice, "Just once more, give me a chance, just one chance, and I promise that I will turn away from sin and never look back again." He had been given the chance and now it was time for him to live up to his promise. The fire had reduced everything to ashes as it smoldered and died down. Salaar washed away all traces with the hosepipe. As he turned towards the wash basin, Salaar noted that though the gold chain around his neck had been snatched away, the platinum and diamond stud in his earlobe was intact. They had not paid attention to that, probably because his long hair had concealed it, or even if they had seen it they might have thought it worthless. Salaar took off the stud and put it on the counter. Then taking a pair of clippers from his shaving kit, he began to chop off his hair, mercilessly, heartlessly. The water from the running tap was draining away the cut hair. Then he began to shave his face. It was as if he wanted to remove all signs of his former self. Then he took off his clothes and unwrapped the bandages on his arms. He stepped under the shower. For 1 whole hour he washed every part of his body, reciting the kalima as he did so, as if he had been brought into the circle of Islam for the first time, as if he had become a Muslim for the first time. When he emerged from the bathroom, he opened the fridge and took out an apple. Having eaten it, he lay down to sleep. He awoke when the alarm he had set before sleeping rang out. "My God, Salaar! What have you done to your hair?" Looking at him, Taiba forgot for a moment that he could not speak up. Salaar pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket and put it before her. It said, "I want to go to the market." It was 2 in the afternoon. "What do you need?" Taiba looked at in surprise. "It's been a few hours since you got home from the hospital and you've not even recovered completely, and now you want to go roaming about again." She reprimanded him gently. "I want to go and buy some books. I'm not going gallivanting." He wrote and passed the paper to her. Taiba looked at him and replied, "Very well, go with the driver." It was past sunset when he stepped out into the market. The lights had come on, creating an ambience of color and life all around. He saw young people moving about, dressed in Western clothes, carefree, laughing, enjoying themselves. Among them, he felt, most unusually, the same sense of fear that he had experienced 48 hours ago in the Margolis. He too was one of these youngsters, laughing, joking, teasing girls, passing unsavory remarks. Head bowed and without caring to look anywhere, he entered the bookshop that lay ahead. He took out the paper listing the books he wanted and put it before the shopkeeper. He wanted a copy of the Quran's translation and some books about prayers. The shopkeeper, who knew him well, looked at him in amazement. Salaar used to go there to buy pornographic magazines and the latest novels of Sidney Sheldon, Harold Robbins, and the like. Salaar had understood the man's surprise. Instead of looking him in the eye, Salaar kept looking at the counter. The shopkeeper, after instructing a salesman, turned to Salaar. "You've come after a long time. Were you away somewhere?" Salaar shook his head and scribbled, "Was out for studies" on a piece of paper. "And what's wrong with your throat?" "Nothing much, just sore." He scribbled again. The salesman returned with the translation of the Quran and the other books Salaar wanted. "Oh yes. There's quite a trend these days for reading up on Islam. It's a good thing too, especially if you're abroad, the shopkeeper stated with a smile, in a business-like way. Salaar was unresponsive. He began to skim through the books placed before him. A few moments later, to the right of the Quran, he saw a pile of pornographic magazines. He looked up in surprise. "These have just come in, I thought I'd show them to you. Perhaps, you might want to buy them." Salaar looked at the translation of the Quran and then those magazines, lying a few inches away, and a wave of fury coursed through him. Why? He didn't know. With his left hand he picked up that pile and flung it as far as he could across the shop. For a few moments there was complete silence. The salesman stood aghast. "Bill." Salaar scrawled and held it to the salesman's face. The man, without a word, began to calculate the amount for the books Salaar had selected. Salaar paid up and was out of the shop with his books. "Idiot," he heard someone say as he stepped out. It was a girl, and Salaar did not bother to see who it was. He knew that he was the object of the remark. His voice was restored 2 weeks later, although it was still quite hoarse. At least he could speak. In these 2 weeks he had been on a soul-searching journey, something he was doing for the first time in all his years. Perhaps it was the first time that he had realized that there was such a thing as the soul, and if there was a problem with one's soul. He had entered a phase of silence, not to speak but only to listen. And listening was, at times, more important. It dawned on him for the first time. He had never been afraid of the night before, but after this incident he was terrified of the dark. He slept with the light switched on. He had recognized those 2 boys in police custody, but he had refused to accompany them to that place where they had left him trussed up. He did not want to go through any mental torment again. He had never experienced so many sleepless nights as he did now and was compelled to take sleeping pills. Sometimes when he didn't take sedatives, he'd spent the entire night wide awake. In New Haven too there had been times like this, painful and tortuous, but then it was more of confusion and restlessness, and maybe, remorse. But now he was going through a third state, fear. He could not determine what fear had overcome him that night in the hills. Was it the fear of death, or the grave, or hell? Imama had said that after ecstasy comes pain, death was pain. She said that after pain was nothingness, the grave was nothingness. She said that after nothingness would come hell. He did not want to reach that stage. He wanted to be saved from that ecstasy that would lead him from pain to hell. If I didn't know about these things, how come Imama did? She's about the same age as me and comes from a similar background, then how did she have the answers to all these questions? He would think, astonished. She had the same luxuries as I did, so what made us different? What was the school of thought she belonged to, and why did she not want to be part of it? He read about them now and it added to his confusion. Was the Prophet's, peace be upon him, finality such an important issue that a girl should want to leave home forever? I didn't marry S.A.W because he did not believe in the finality of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Do you think I'd be ready to marry someone like you who, though he believes in the Prophet's, peace be upon him, station, lives a sinful life and does all that my Prophet, peace be upon him, has asked us to refrain from? If I do not marry one who does not believe in the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, I will not marry one who flouts his instructions either. He remembered each word spoken by Imama Hashim and now he was pondering over their meaning. You will not understand this, she had often told him, so often that it had begun to annoy him. What was she trying to prove anyway? Her superiority, that she was a great scholar or that she was very pious, and he was inferior? But now he realized that she was right. He really was not capable of appreciating her thought. How can a worm that lives in the muck know what dirt is? To such a one all others seemed to be in the pits. He was like that worm then. I loathe the look in your eyes, and your unbuttoned shirt. He too now began to detest these things. For a long time, this statement had echoed in his head like a buzzword every time he faced the mirror. Try as he would to shake it off or lose himself in his work, it had gone on repeating itself. Now he had started buttoning up and keeping his gaze lowered. He could not even look himself in the eye in the mirror. No one had ever told him such a thing about his eyes, and certainly not a girl. Imama was the first one to do so, and it was not his eyes but the look in them that was loathsome. Imama had identified that look. He used to talk to girls who looked him in the eye and spoke candidly. He enjoyed their company. Imama did not do so. She'd look at him but not directly, and if she found him staring, she'd look away. Salaar had the mistaken notion that she looked away because she found his eyes mesmerizing. "I loathe the look in your eyes, and your unbuttoned shirt." Hearing her say this over the phone, he had been quite shocked. Eyes are the windows of the soul, he recalled reading this somewhere. So did his eyes really reflect the sordid depths of his soul? He was not surprised. It must be so, but to recognize this filth, there must be a criterion of purity before one. Imama Hashim was that example of purity. "You need not explain or instruct me now. You will have no further cause for complaint," said Salaar without looking up at Sikandar. He was going back to Yale, and before his departure, Sikandar, with a faint hope of change, had launched into the usual instructions and admonitions. But even before he could complete his words, Salaar had assured him sincerely, for the first time, and Sikandar had faith in his son's assurance, for the first time ever. He had been observant of the change in Salaar after the incident in the hills. Salaar was not the same person. His thought processes, his attitude, his appearance, his very life had changed. It was as if the flame within him had been extinguished. Whether these changes were right or wrong, good or bad, Sikandar was yet unable to comment, but he did know that there had been a major impact in Salaar's life which had brought about this change. He did not realize that this was the first time that Salaar had been defeated, and the first blow in life brings stalwarts to their knees. Salaar was just a strip of a boy barely into his 20s. Sometimes in our lives we do not know whether we have emerged from darkness into light or if we are entering into the dark. The direction is unknown. But one can differentiate, in any case, between the earth and the sky. When you raise your head, it is the sky above, and when you lower it, it is the earth below, whether or not it is visible. To move forward in life, you need just 4 points of direction, right and left, ahead and behind. The fifth is the ground under your feet. If that were not there, it would be an abyss, hell, and on arriving there one would have no need of direction. The sixth point of direction was above, and that was unattainable. That was where God was, he who was invisible to the eye but was present in every heartbeat, every pulsing flow of the blood, every breath, every morsel that went down one's throat. To Salaar, his photographic memory, his 150-plus IQ level were a torment now. He wanted to forget everything, all that he had been doing till now, all that he could not forget. If only someone could understand his agony. End of chapter 5.